Harold Mercer slammed his fist on the magistrate's desk so hard the ink bottle jumped. "I want her gone," he said. "Today. Whatever she owes me, I'm done carrying it." The magistrate, a thin man named Colfax, who smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, looked up from his ledger with the slow, measured patience of someone who had seen everything this town had to offer and was no longer surprised by any of it. "You're listing her as a debt asset," Colfax said. It wasn't a question. "She eats. She takes up space. She hasn't brought a single coin into this house in 2 years." Harold pulled a folded paper from his coat. His hands were steady. That was the part that would stay with Evelyn longest, how steady his hands were. "I've written it all out, every meal, every yard of cloth, every winter she cost me. It totals out to $41 and change. Rand Colby holds my marker for 43. I'm settling both debts at once." The magistrate looked at the paper. Then he looked at Evelyn, who was standing near the door with her wrists bound in front of her with a length of rough rope. Not because she had struggled, not because she had run, but because Harold had decided the optics of it would make things go faster. She had not cried. That was the other part she would remember. She had told herself she would not give him the satisfaction, and she had kept that promise to herself, even as her wrists burned and the rope fibers worked into her skin. She was 23 years old, and her uncle was selling her in a courthouse. The room wasn't crowded when it started. A Wednesday morning, gray outside, the kind of cold that didn't quite commit to frost, but made everything feel damp and miserable. Maybe a dozen people had come in for other business. A property transfer, a licensing matter, the usual rhythms of a small frontier town grinding forward. But word moved through Black Ridge the way it always did, which was fast and low, and by the time Colfax called the matter to order, there were 30 people pressed against the back wall. Evelyn felt all of them looking at her. She was not a small woman. That was the fact the world had arranged itself around for as long as she could remember. She was broad through the shoulders and wide through the hips, and she carried more weight than the fashion plates in the magazines suggested a woman ought to carry, and not a single person in her life had ever let her forget it. Not the girls at school, not the women at church, not Harold, who had taken her in after her parents died of fever when she was 14 and had been reminding her of her deficiencies ever since. She stood in Colfax's office with her bound wrists held in front of her like an offering, and she kept her chin up because it was the only dignity she had left, and she was not ready to surrender it. "The matter before us," Colfax said, in the bored monotone of a man reading a tax roll, "is the assignment of one Evelyn Ruth Mercer, age 23, unmarried, to satisfy a debt of record between Harold Mercer and Rand Colby in the amount of $41.60, with the remainder to be forgiven as consideration for the transaction." Someone in the back of the room laughed, not loudly, just a snort, quickly swallowed, but Evelyn heard it. "Now hold on," said a man near the window. That was Rand Colby himself, a heavy-set man in a good coat, with a gambler's eyes that were always a little too still. He looked Evelyn over with the frank, calculating expression of someone examining livestock at an auction. "I don't want her. What am I supposed to do with her? She's not—" He gestured vaguely in her direction. "She's not exactly what a man's looking for." The laughter was louder this time. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She fixed her eyes on a water stain on the wall above Colfax's head, and she breathed through her nose, and she did not let her face do anything at all. Harold shrugged, unbothered. "That's your problem. We agreed to a human asset. She's human." "She's enormous," Rand said, and now half the room was laughing openly, and Colfax was making only a minimal effort to restore order, and Evelyn stood in the center of it with her chin up and her wrists burning and something dying very quietly behind her eyes. Colfax raised his hand. "Order. Mr. Colby, you have options. You may accept the assignment and dispose of the asset as you see fit, or you may decline and the debt stands." "I'm not taking her," Rand said flatly. "Look at her. What am I going to do with a woman that size? She'd eat half my profits just standing there." More laughter. Someone said something Evelyn couldn't quite hear and didn't want to, and the person next to them said something back, and the room was warming up now. The way rooms do when a crowd finds a shared target, everyone feeding off everyone else's willingness to be cruel. "In that case," Colfax said, with the weary efficiency of someone who wanted to be done with his Wednesday, "the court declares the asset unencumbered and available to any party willing to assume the original debt value. $41.60. Any takers?" Silence. Then someone made a joke about needing a bigger door frame. The laughter peaked. Evelyn breathed. In, out. She was still looking at the water stain. "Free to anyone willing to take her then," Colfax said. "We'll give it a moment." That was the word that cut deepest. Free. As if she were a piece of furniture someone had left on a porch. As if 23 years of living had reduced her to something a stranger might or might not bother to pick up on their way past. She thought about her mother, who had been a strong woman with quick hands and a loud laugh. She thought about what her mother would have said about this room, these people, this rope around her wrists. She thought her mother would have been furious in a way that was almost beautiful to witness, the kind of fury that came from a place of absolute certainty about your own worth. Evelyn was not furious. She was something quieter and heavier than that. She was 23 years old, and she was standing in a courthouse being given away like a broken cart, and she did not know what came next, and she was more tired than she had ever been in her life. The door opened. She didn't see him at first. She was still looking at the wall. She heard the door, heard the change in the room, the laughter stopping mid-note, the way a music box stops when someone puts a hand over it. And she heard the boots on the floor, slow and deliberate, crossing the room without any apparent hurry. She looked. He was not what she expected, though she hadn't been expecting anything in particular. He was tall in the way that frontiermen sometimes were, the kind of tall that looked like it had been earned through hard years rather than born into, and he was broad across the back and wore a coat that had been repaired in several places with different colored thread, which she noticed because she noticed things like that. His face was weathered in the way that faces get when a man spends most of his time above the tree line, and he had a beard that was more practical than decorative, and his eyes, when they swept the room, were the particular flat gray of a sky that has decided to do something decisive with the weather. He walked to Colfax's desk and stopped. "How much?" he said. It was not quite a question. Colfax blinked. The room was absolutely silent. "I beg your pardon? How much did you say? The debt value?" $41.60. The man reached into his coat and put money on Colfax's desk. Evelyn could see it was exact. He counted it out in a way that suggested he had made the calculation before he walked through the door. He didn't look at Evelyn while he did it. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Colfax, and he waited. "Sir," Colfax said, staring at the money, "you understand what that is, the transaction involves—" "I can read the paper," the man said. "Give me something to sign." Someone in the room said, "Hale." Just the name, low, and the name moved through the crowd like a cold draft. Evelyn watched faces change. Rand Colby, who had been smirking since the proceedings began, pulled his expression into something more neutral. Harold, who had been standing to the side looking pleased with himself, went a little still. The man, Hale, signed the paper. Colfax slid across the desk. His handwriting, Evelyn saw, was plain and deliberate. Gideon Hale. He signed it the way a man signs a receipt for supplies, without drama, without ceremony. Then he turned, and for the first time he actually looked at her. She looked back. She had kept her chin up through everything else, and she kept it up now, though something in his direct gaze made it harder than it had been, because he was looking at her like she was a person, not a spectacle, not a problem to be disposed of, not something the room had decided was worth laughing at. He looked at her the way you look at someone you are actually seeing, and she found she didn't quite know what to do with it. He crossed to where she was standing, and he looked at the rope around her wrists. "Who put this on you?" he said. She glanced at Harold. Gideon Hale followed her glance. He turned back to her and took a folding knife from his belt. The room tensed, and cut the rope in 2 cuts, clean, without touching her wrists. The rope fell to the floor. Evelyn's hands were shaking. She hadn't realized until they were free. "Come on then," Gideon said. And he walked toward the door. She looked at the room, at Harold, who was counting his relief more than his money, at Rand Colby, who was looking at Gideon's back with an expression she couldn't quite read, at the crowd that had been laughing at her 3 minutes ago and was now very quiet. She picked up the rope from the floor. She didn't know why. She just did it. She folded it and put it in her pocket, and then she walked out of the courthouse behind Gideon Hale into the gray November morning without looking back at any of them. If you've ever been the person in that room that everyone was laughing at, stick with me. This story is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. Before we go further, if you're new here, please subscribe to this channel and follow along to the end. We put up new stories every week, and if you don't want to miss what comes next, the subscribe button is right there. And do me a favor, drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to Evelyn and Gideon. His horse was a big bay animal tied to the post outside the courthouse, and beside it was a mule loaded with winter supplies, sacks of flour, dried beans, a coil of rope, things that spoke of practical long-term planning rather than a quick trip to town. Gideon untied both animals and handed Evelyn the mule's lead without a word. She took it. They walked out of Black Ridge without speaking. Evelyn kept waiting for the conversation, for the terms, for the explanation of what she owed him now, for the rules of whatever arrangement this was. It didn't come. Gideon walked beside the horse with one hand on the bridle, and he didn't say anything at all, and after a while Evelyn understood that the silence was not hostile. He was simply not a man who talked to fill space. They were 2 hours out of town before she spoke. "Where are we going?" she said. "North," he said. "Up past the second ridge. I've got a place." "How far?" "Day and a half, moving steady." She absorbed that. "On foot?" He looked at her. Something in her face must have said the right thing, because he reached up and swung himself into the saddle and then looked down at her in a way that she realized was actually an offer. She was a tall woman and the horse was tall, and it took her 2 attempts to get up behind him, which were not graceful attempts, and she ended up grabbing his coat with both hands to avoid sliding off the back. He didn't say anything about that either. He just waited until she had settled, and then he pressed his heels into the horse's sides, and they moved north. Evelyn sat behind this stranger on a horse going to a place she'd never been, and she thought about the rope in her pocket, and she thought about her mother, and she thought, well, here we are then. It was not a plan. It was barely even a thought. It was just the acknowledgement that this was what had happened, and that she was still in it, still breathing, still looking at the world with both eyes open. She supposed that was enough for now. The first night they made camp where a creek cut through a stand of spruce, and Gideon built a fire with the efficiency of long practice. Not a performance of skill, just a man who had done this hundreds of times and saw no reason to make it interesting. He set a pot of water on to boil and put dried meat and onion into it, and that was supper, and it was plain and not enough, and Evelyn ate every bite. He had a second bedroll in the mule's packs, which he set on the far side of the fire from his own without comment. She wasn't sure what she had been expecting, but it wasn't that. She pulled the blanket up and looked at the fire and listened to the dark outside the camp, which was very full of sound once you stopped expecting it to be quiet. Wind, water, something moving in the spruce, the horses breathing. "Why?" she said, to the fire, not exactly to him. "Why what?" "Why did you do it? Back there?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I was in town for supplies. I heard there was something happening at the courthouse. I went in. And then you just, it wasn't right," he said. "What they were doing, that's all. You spent $41 because something wasn't right. I've spent money on worse reasons." She turned that over. It was not a satisfying explanation. It was barely an explanation at all. But she had the sense that it was the true one, which was more than she usually got from people. "I'm not going to..." She started and stopped and tried again. "Whatever you think you're getting, I don't know what kind of arrangement you're thinking, but I'm telling you now that I'm not thinking any kind of arrangement," he said. I wasn't defensive about it, just flat and informational, like he was correcting a wrong turn on a map. "I need someone who can work. My place is up in the hills, and I'm gone for weeks at a time in trapping season, and I need someone who can manage things while I'm away. That's it. That's the whole of it." "You didn't have to buy a person for that," Evelyn said. "You could have hired someone." "People I can hire don't want to spend a winter above the second ridge with nobody for company," he said. "You don't have another option right now, so here we are." It was brutally practical. It was also, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years, possibly ever. He hadn't told her she'd be fine. He hadn't told her she was lucky. He'd told her the situation as it was, with herself and her own limited options included in it, and somehow that was easier to receive than comfort would have been. "What do you need done?" she said. "At this place of yours." He looked at her then, across the fire, and something in his expression, not quite surprise but a kind of recalibration, told her that was the right answer. Everything, he said. There's always more to do than I can do. Firewood, cooking, the kitchen garden in spring, tending the animals, keeping the roof from caving. You'll see when we get there. All right, she said. He nodded once and looked back at the fire. Evelyn lay down and pulled the blanket up and stared at the canopy of spruce branches overhead, black against a navy sky that was starting to show the first hard points of stars. Her wrists still hurt where the rope had been. Her body ached from the walk and the ride and the weight of the day. Tomorrow she would see what she had walked into. Tomorrow she would assess and decide what was possible and what wasn't. Tonight she was going to let herself be tired. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the coiled length of rope, and she thought, that's the last time anyone puts that on me. That is the very last time. She fell asleep before the fire burned all the way down, which was the first good thing that had happened to her in longer than she could remember. The second day was harder than the first. The trail climbed steadily after the midday break, and the wind picked up from the northwest with a sharpness that said winter was not far behind it. Gideon moved at a pace that was easy for him and challenging for Evelyn, who was fit in the way that poor people are fit, from necessity, from hauling water and chopping wood and doing the work that needed doing, but who was not accustomed to mountain grades. She didn't complain. She kept up. He noticed. She could tell by the way he occasionally adjusted his pace without saying so, taking a slightly longer rest at the creek, moving a little slower on the worst of the switchbacks. He did it without drawing attention to it, and she appreciated that more than she could say. Late in the afternoon, the trail leveled out onto a shelf of land that opened up in a way that took her breath away against her will. A broad valley below, mountains in three directions, and the quality of light at that altitude that made everything look slightly more real than it had any right to. She stopped walking. She just stood there. That's the valley, Gideon said from a few paces ahead. I can see that. Most people have that reaction the first time. Then why live up here, she said, which was a real question, not a complaint. Because most people don't come up past the valley, he said, and kept walking. The cabin came into view 20 minutes later, a low-slung log structure that was solid rather than grand, with a shed attached and a small barn set back to the left. It was not beautiful. It had clearly been built by one person over time, each addition done when it was needed rather than all at once, so the proportions were slightly off in ways that were human and understandable. But the roof looked sound, and the chimney was straight, and there was a wood pile that suggested someone had been thinking ahead. Evelyn stood outside it and looked at it. It's yours for the winter, Gideon said from behind her. At minimum. She turned to look at him. The late light was hitting the side of his face, and it made him look tired in a way his manner didn't, the kind of tired that goes down to the bone and has been there for years. For the winter, she said. And then? And then we see, he said. Same as everything else. It was not a promise. It was not an invitation. It was simply the acknowledgement that neither of them knew what came next, and that pretending otherwise would be a waste of both their time. Evelyn picked up the mule's lead and walked toward the barn. There was nothing to do right now, except begin. The barn smelled like old hay and something that had wintered there before and left its mark in the wood. Evelyn found 2 goats in the back stall, a gray one and a brown one, both of whom regarded her with the frank suspicion of animals who had learned not to trust new things. There was also a workhorse broader than Gideon's Bay, a small flock of chickens roosting in the rafters despite the fact that there was a perfectly functional co-op visible through the side door, and a cat that was missing most of one ear and all of its patience for being looked at. She checked the water, checked the hay, found where the grain was stored, and fed everything in the order that made the most sense. Then she stood in the center of the barn and took stock of what needed attention and what could wait, the way her mother had taught her to do with any new situation before she let herself feel anything about it. The list of what needed attention was long. She went inside. The cabin was a single main room with a loft, a fireplace that took up most of the north wall, a wood stove in the kitchen corner, and furniture that had been built by someone who knew what they were doing but had been working alone, so everything was proportioned for one person's habits and one person's sense of space. The table was too low. The chairs were placed in ways that suggested a man who ate quickly and alone and didn't see much reason to arrange things otherwise. There were books stacked on a shelf, more than she expected, and a set of tools hanging on the wall so precisely organized that it looked almost like a kind of care, the only thing in the whole cabin that did. Gideon was already unloading the mule outside. Evelyn located the kindling box, found it half empty, found the small axe near the door, and split wood for 20 minutes in the cold until there was enough to start a proper fire and keep it going through the night. She was not graceful about it. She never had been. But she was accurate and she was persistent, and by the time Gideon came back inside, she had a fire going and the wood stove warming and a pot of water on that she'd packed with the last of the dried venison from the camp supplies. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the fire. "You didn't have to." "I was cold," she said. It was true. It was also easier than explaining that she needed to do something with her hands before the day caught up with her. He nodded and hung his coat on the peg near the door and sat down at the table and said nothing, and that became the shape of their first evening. Two people in a small space, each doing what needed to be done, the silence between them neither hostile nor comfortable yet, just present. She served the soup because it was ready and it would get cold otherwise. He ate without comment. She ate across the table from him, and the table was genuinely too low for her, and her knees didn't fit right, and she had to hunch forward in a way that was uncomfortable. But she didn't say anything about it that first night. She said nothing about it the second night either, but on the third morning she woke early to find Gideon already up and working at the table with a measuring tool she didn't know the name of, running it along the table leg with a focused expression. And by mid-morning the table was 4 inches taller and she could sit at it like a person. He didn't say anything about it, just put the tools away and went outside. She stood at the table and put both hands flat on the surface and felt the height of it, and something in her chest moved in a way she couldn't name and didn't try to. The first week was mostly assessment. Evelyn moved through the cabin and the outbuildings the way she'd learned to move through any new situation, quietly and systematically, finding what was there and what was absent and where the problems were. There were many problems. The cabin had been built and maintained by a man who was away for long stretches and made do with what was at hand when he returned, so repairs had been done in the order they became emergencies rather than in any planned way. The south wall had a gap near the foundation that let cold air in steadily. 3 of the roof shingles on the shed were cracked and would leak when the snow came. The kitchen garden had been put to bed for winter without fully clearing the failed plants, which would cause trouble come spring. She started with the wall gap because cold air is immediate and firewood is effort, and she used the chinking materials she found in the shed, mud mixed with dried grass, the old way, not elegant but effective. And she filled it in 2 hours and covered it with a board for good measure. She moved to the shingles next, which required getting onto the shed roof, which required the ladder, which was in the barn, and had a broken rung she fixed first. Gideon came out of the cabin on the second day to find her on the shed roof. "What are you doing?" he said. "What does it look like?" "It looks like you're on the roof." "3 shingles are cracked," she said. "It'll leak when the snow hits." He looked at the roof. He looked at her. He said, "I was going to do that." "Were you?" she said, without particular accusation, just an acknowledgement that people often mean to do things. He was quiet for a moment. "There's a better way to seat the nails on those. You want me to show you?" "Yes," she said, because she did. He climbed up and showed her, and she watched his hands and did it the way he showed her, and it was genuinely better. They didn't talk much while they worked. They didn't need to. When the shingles were done, he climbed down first and held the ladder, which was a practical thing to do and which she chose to interpret as nothing more than that. That was the beginning of how they figured each other out. Not through conversation, but through the grammar of shared work, who noticed what and who knew how and where the gaps were between them that needed bridging. The nights were the harder part. There was plenty of work in the daylight hours to keep the mind occupied, but after supper, when the fire settled into its steady work, and the dark outside pressed against the one-glass window, the cabin got very small and very quiet, and they had nothing to do but exist in the same space, which neither of them was accustomed to. Gideon read. He had a particular way of reading, completely, almost aggressively, like the book was an argument he was trying to win. He held it with both hands and didn't look up and didn't make small talk, and Evelyn found she didn't mind this as much as she might have expected, because it meant she wasn't required to perform anything. She had found an unfinished mending basket by the fire on the second day and had assumed it was meant to be done and done it, and found that whatever the basket's original purpose had been, it was now hers by default, which gave her something to do with her hands while he read. On the 8th night, he put the book down and said, without preamble, "You don't have to do that." She looked up. "The mending?" "Any of it. The roof, the wall. You've been working since the day we got here." "So have you." "That's different. This is my place." Evelyn put down the sock she was darning and looked at him across the fire. "You said you needed someone who could work." "I'm working." "Why is that a problem?" "It's not a problem," he said, and something in his tone was uncomfortable, like a man trying to say something and not knowing the exact words for it. "I just don't want you to think I don't want you working out of fear." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, which was true. "Okay," he said. "I'm working because there's work to be done, and I don't know what else to do with myself yet," she said. "I'm not good at sitting." He looked at her. "Neither am I." "Then we have that in common," she said, and picked the sock back up. He picked the book back up. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce, and the horses shifted in the barn, and the dark was very complete and very cold. It was not comfort exactly, but it was something in the neighborhood of it. November pulled itself tighter around the mountain. The temperatures dropped in a way that was not gradual but sudden, the way mountain weather works. Fine in the morning, dangerous by afternoon, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in your clothing and your thinking both. Evelyn learned to read the sky the way Gideon read it, watching for the particular yellow quality of light that meant weather was building, watching the way the animals behaved when something was coming. She learned by asking. That surprised her about herself. She had not thought she was someone who asked, because asking had always cost her something back in Black Ridge, always invited the commentary about how she should know better or couldn't expect to understand. But Gideon answered questions the way he did everything, without decoration. He told her what he knew and stopped when he told her, and didn't add the parts about how she should have known already. "How do you read the clouds for snow?" she asked one afternoon, standing in the yard with both of them looking north. "Color first," he said. "That gray-green, that's just cold. The blue-white, that's moisture. You see them stacking up behind the far ridge, that's your warning, usually 4 to 6 hours. And then you stop working and come in? And then I make sure everything that needs to be inside is inside," he said. "Then I come in." "What happened last winter?" she asked, because the barn showed signs of a repair done in a hurry. Boards of different ages patched together on the east wall. He looked at the barn. "Lost a goat. Barn door came off in the wind, found her 3 days later when the melt came." He said it without sentimentality, but she heard something in it anyway. He'd been up here alone, and he'd lost the goat, and he'd found her when the snow pulled back, and he'd been the only person to know about it. "That won't happen this winter," she said. He glanced at her. "Because you'll be here?" "Because I'm going to put a second latch on that door," she said. "But also, yes." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the equipment for one, briefly assembled. By December, the snow had come in earnest, and the days organized themselves around the fire and the animals and the stock of food they'd laid in, and Evelyn discovered that survival at altitude in winter was a full-time occupation with no days off and very little room for error. There was firewood to split every morning because a day's heat required more than you thought it did. There were animals to tend twice daily regardless of temperature. There were the goats to milk and the milk to manage before it froze, and the chickens to negotiate with because the cold made them stupid and mean, and they needed more managing than seemed reasonable for an animal that small. She learned to do all of it. She did some of it badly at first. She'd never milked a goat before, and the gray one in particular had strong opinions about technique, and she did some of it awkwardly, and she did some of it in ways that Gideon corrected without cruelty, once or twice with something that might have been amusement under the instruction. "She doesn't like hesitation," he said. The third morning, Evelyn came in from the barn with less milk than she should have had. "She can tell when you're not sure." "I'm not sure," Evelyn said. "She bites." "She doesn't bite, she nips." "I'm aware of the distinction," Evelyn said. "My hand is aware of the distinction." He laughed. It was brief and quiet, and she wasn't sure she'd heard it right, but she had. She filed it away. By the second week of December, she had the goats figured out well enough that they'd started coming to her when she appeared in the barn, which was a form of acceptance she hadn't known she was waiting for until she had it. The days shortened until there were only a handful of hours of real light, and in that strange compression of wintertime, they talked more. Not about large things, mostly about the work, about what needed doing, about the animals and the weather and the state of the supplies. But sometimes the conversations would shift, late at night, when the fire had been built up, and there was nowhere to go and nothing left to do. She learned he had trapped these mountains for 12 years, that before this place he'd had a homestead further north that he'd left and didn't discuss in any detail, that he could repair almost anything mechanical with whatever materials were at hand, and that this skill came from a period of his life he was also not detailed about, that he'd been married. She learned that last thing not from him but from the evidence of the cabin. A woman's apron hung on a peg she hadn't touched, a pair of boots too small for Gideon stored carefully at the back of the loft, a pressed wildflower between the pages of one of the books she'd pulled down to read. She didn't ask about it. She put the book back and didn't say anything, because there were things a person kept behind glass, and it wasn't her place to put her hands on them. Not yet. Possibly not ever. What she did learn about him was the practical shape of who he was, and that turned out to be a great deal. He was fair, relentlessly fair, in a way that was almost inconvenient sometimes, because it meant he held himself to the same standards he held everything else to, and he was not easy on himself. When something went wrong, a tool broken, an animal ailing, a fence that hadn't held, he didn't look for somewhere to put the blame. He looked at what had happened and what needed to be different next time, and then he moved on. It was such a different way of operating than anything she'd been around that she kept noticing it. The way you notice a sound that's been there all along, but that you've only just learned to hear. Christmas passed without ceremony because neither of them raised it. The day itself was cold and clear, and they did the work and ate supper, and Gideon produced, without comment, a small paper-wrapped parcel that turned out to contain a folding comb and a small pot of hand salve, because her hands had been cracking from the cold, and he had evidently noticed. She held the items for a moment and felt something complicated move through her. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and looked at his food. She had made an extra portion of the dried apple pudding she'd worked out a way to make with their stores, which was not fancy and was slightly lumpy in a way she hadn't fully solved. But he ate it all, which was how Gideon expressed appreciation for something. It was not a celebration, but it was not nothing. January was the hard month. She'd known it would be. She'd grown up in frontier country, and she understood that winter doesn't deliver its worst until it's been there long enough to know you. The cold in January was a different animal than the cold in November. It was committed. It came without the warnings the November cold gave you, without the signals and the grace periods. It came, and it stayed, and it pressed. The water barrel inside the cabin froze solid one January night despite the banked fire, and she found it in the morning and spent the better part of the morning melting snow on the stove, which was tedious and inefficient and humbling. And she thought about everything she'd always taken for granted about water. They were moving through the firewood faster than the calculation Gideon had made in autumn, because the January cold required more heat than predicted, and this was a real concern that they talked about plainly at the table. "We can stretch it," Gideon said. "Keep the main room warmer in the mornings and let the stove bank lower in the night. I'll add to the pile when the weather permits." "I can cut," Evelyn said. "I know you can." "I'm not asking permission," she said. I'm telling you I'll do it." He looked at her across the table. "The big axe is—" "I know where it is," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay." She cut wood for 3 days in every break between storms. Her shoulders ached in a way that sat deep in the muscle, not the surface ache of new work, but the bone-level complaint of sustained effort, and she ignored it because ignoring it was the available option. She added to the pile. It would be enough. She intended it to be enough. Gideon said nothing for the first day, and on the second day he came out and cut alongside her, and they worked with the rhythm of two people who've learned how to occupy the same space without getting in each other's way, which is its own kind of conversation. On the third day he took the axe from her hands, mid-swing, not stopping her exactly, but stilling her, and looked at her palms. The blisters had broken and reopened enough times that the skin had started doing something she hadn't wanted to think about. "You should have said something," he said. "It's fine." "It's not fine, Evelyn." It was the first time he'd used her name, and the sound of it in his voice was strange and grounding at the same time. "Come inside." She came inside. He had the salve out. the same salve he'd given her at Christmas. And he sat across from her at the table and waited. And she put her hands on the table, palms up, which felt more vulnerable than she'd anticipated, and he applied the salve with the focused, impersonal care of someone who knows how to treat a wound without making it about anything other than the wound. He did not comment on the state of her hands. He did not tell her she should have been more careful. He looked at what was there, and he addressed it, and he covered it with strips of clean cloth, and he said, "Rest them tonight. I'll cut tomorrow." "Gideon, one day," he said. "That's all I'm asking." She rested her hands. It was harder than cutting wood in a way. Sitting still with the awareness that she needed something from the day and couldn't take it herself. That was the kind of helplessness she found almost unbearable. She sat by the fire and read one of his books, which was a history of the fur trade that she found genuinely interesting and which surprised her, because she hadn't thought she'd be interested. She read for 3 hours, and it was the first time in months she'd done something for no reason other than that it held her attention. When Gideon came in from cutting, she put the book back and said, "This is good. The trade history." He stopped taking off his coat. "You read it?" "Started it," she said. "Is that all right?" "That's—" He hung the coat. "Yes, it's fine. It's good. Help yourself to any of them." She looked at the shelf. There were maybe 30 books, and the mix of them told her things she didn't have words for yet. Novels alongside surveying manuals, alongside a book of philosophy she'd heard of but never read, alongside a battered almanac that looked like it had been consulted so many times the spine had given up. "You've read all of these," she said. "Some of them twice," he said. "The philosophy one?" He glanced at the shelf. "3 times. I'm still not sure what he's saying." "That's not a great sign," she said. "Or he's very good," Gideon said. "One or the other." February came and the cold did not lift. But something else changed, something subtler, in the way the cabin felt after 3 months of shared habitation. The strangeness had worn off. The wariness was still there. They were still careful with each other, in the ways that 2 people are careful when they don't quite know what they are to each other. But the labor of performing normalcy had eased, and what was left under it was something that felt, if not easy, then at least honest. She caught herself telling him things. Small things at first. An observation about the gray goat's temperament. A question about the marks she'd found on the trees below the ridge. Then larger things. The kind of things she'd carried for years without anyone to give them to. She told him about her mother, one evening in February, not meaning to, but also not stopping herself. She told him about the laugh and the quick hands and the way she'd made whatever house they lived in feel like it was theirs. And she told him about the fever that had taken both her parents in the same week when Evelyn was 14 and how she'd gone to Harold's house with one trunk, and the absolute certainty that she would be all right, because her mother had raised her to be all right, and how that certainty had been used against her for 9 years. Gideon listened. He was very still when he listened, not the stillness of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the stillness of someone who is actually taking something in. When she was done, he said, 9 years is a long time to carry that. "It is," she said. "You seem like you've come out the other side of it mostly intact," he said, and something in the word mostly was more honest than if he'd said fully, because he was right. She wasn't fully intact. There were places that were still broken that she managed around rather than through, and the fact that he seemed to understand that without being told was something she held quietly for a long time after. She didn't ask about his wife that night. She didn't ask the next night either, but she asked the night after, because the question was there, and not asking it had started to feel like a kind of lie. "The boots in the loft," she said, "and the apron." He looked at the fire for a long time. "Clara," he said, "you don't have to tell me." "I know." He was quiet. "She died 4 years ago. There was a child, too, a boy. They went the same winter." He paused. "Fever." Evelyn looked at him. She thought about saying she was sorry because she was, but the words seemed inadequate to the weight of it. 2 deaths in 1 winter, a wife and a child, and this man alone on a mountain with the apron still hanging on the peg. "I kept working," he said. "That's all I knew to do. Just kept working. Added on to the cabin. Fixed everything that needed fixing. Ran the trap lines. Kept moving." "It helps," she said. "Moving." "For a while," he said. "And then it's just moving." She understood that. She understood the difference between movement as survival and movement as avoidance, because she had been in both places herself, and she knew that at some point you had to stop and face what was still standing behind you. She didn't say that. It wasn't her place, and it wasn't the right night. She just sat with what he'd told her and let it be what it was, which was a grief that had been lived with for 4 years and hadn't become smaller, just more familiar. March came with the first suggestion of softening in the air, the quality of light in the late afternoon shifting towards something less severe. The snow was still deep, but it changed character, became less hostile and more just present, the way a difficult season does when it starts to turn. The animals felt it. The goats got restless in the barn, pressing against the gate in the morning, like they'd been told something the humans hadn't heard yet. Evelyn was in the barn feeding the chickens, who had, over the course of the winter, developed a complicated relationship with her involving both dependence and suspicion. When she heard Gideon's boots on the frozen ground outside, the particular sound of him moving with purpose rather than errand. He came into the barn and stood in the door. "The gray one's freshening," he said. "I didn't think she would this early." Evelyn looked. The gray goat was in the corner of her stall in the specific posture of an animal about to do something that would require assistance. She'd seen enough livestock in her life to read the signs. "Get the clean cloths," she said, "and that lantern needs more oil." She didn't think about whether she knew what to do. She moved to the stall and talked to the goat in the low, steady voice she'd developed over the winter, the voice that worked on the gray one specifically, and she put her hands where they needed to be, and she did what needed doing, and Gideon held the lantern and handed her things when she asked for them and stayed out of her way otherwise. An hour later, there were 2 kids in the stall, both alive, the smaller one requiring a few minutes of focused attention, and then making a sound that was almost absurdly loud for something that size. Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at them. "2," Gideon said from behind her. "2," she confirmed. She was covered in barn and her knees ached from the stall floor and her hands were a mess, and she felt, more clearly than she had felt anything in a long time, that she was useful. Not in the way Harold had used her, which was the usefulness of a tool, but in the actual sense, that she had done something that needed doing, and she had done it well, and 2 small animals were alive because of it. Gideon reached down and offered her a hand up. She took it, which was a thing she did not usually do, and he pulled her up with the practical ease of someone who is accustomed to pulling things out of difficult positions. And for a moment they were standing very close in the small space of the stall, and she could see in his face the same thing she felt, which was that something had shifted tonight, not dramatically, not in any way either of them would have been able to point to exactly. But the winter had been long, and they had been in it together, and the spring was coming, and there were 2 new animals alive in the barn, and they were standing close enough that she could see the lamplight moving across his face. He stepped back first. "I'll put more hay down," he said. "Yes," she said. "Do that." She stayed with the goat and her kids until they were settled, and then she walked back to the cabin under a sky that was still winter dark, but had something in it, a quality, a suggestion, that said it would not be winter forever. The rope was still in her coat pocket. She didn't know why she still carried it. Maybe because it was the evidence of where she'd been, and she wasn't yet sure she was far enough away from it to put it down. But she was further than she'd been in November. She was, she thought, considerably further than that. Spring came the way it always did at that altitude, not as a relief, but as a negotiation. March gave ground grudgingly, offering 2 warm days and then snatching them back with a late storm that dropped another foot of snow and killed 3 of the kitchen garden's early shoots that Evelyn had started inside and set out too soon. She stood looking at the blackened seedlings and felt the particular frustration of someone who had calculated correctly but been beaten by circumstance anyway. "Too early," Gideon said from behind her. "I know that now," she said. "Another week and the ground would have held." "I know that too," she said. "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. "I lost a whole planting my 2nd year up here. Thought I knew the mountain better than I did." She looked at him. He was not the kind of man who offered consolation. She'd learned that about him over the winter. So when he did it in his particular way, oblique and factual, it was worth something. She picked up the dead seedlings and went back inside and started more in the tin cans she'd been using as pots, and put them back on the south windowsill where the light was best, and that was the end of it. April arrived and kept its promises better. The snow pulled back from the lower meadow first, then from the south-facing slopes, and the mud season that replaced it was its own particular misery. Everything tracked, everything wet, boots that doubled their weight in clay, but it was the productive misery of a season moving forward. The goat kids, whom Evelyn had named despite Gideon's mild suggestion that naming them complicated the practical calculus of farm animals, were growing fast and getting into everything, and the chickens had resumed laying with what felt like personal vindictiveness about making up for lost time. Gideon started talking about the trap lines. He'd been away from them all winter, or rather, he'd run only the nearest ones, the lines he could check and return from in a single day. But the longer lines, the ones that went up into the high country above the second ridge, required overnight camps and extended absences, and those he'd left alone since Evelyn arrived. She'd understood without it being stated that he had stayed closer because of her, not out of distrust but out of a first winter caution, awaiting to see how things would hold before he left them unattended. "I need to check the far lines," he said one evening in late April, "before the season turns too warm, see what's salvageable." "How long?" she said. 3 days out, maybe 4. She looked at the list in her head. The animals, the water, the kitchen garden that was finally establishing itself, the ongoing repair of the fence on the east meadow that neither of them had finished. "I can manage," she said. He looked at her in the way she'd learned meant he was deciding whether to say a thing or leave it. "I know you can," he said. "That's not what I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" He set his coffee cup down. "The spring weather up high is unpredictable. I've been caught before. If I'm not back in 5 days, don't wait past the 6th to go for help." "Where would I go?" she said. It was a real question. The nearest settlement was Black Ridge, a day and a half on horseback. "Miller's place, below the valley," he said. "He's a good man. He'll help you." She absorbed that. The fact that he'd thought this through, had a specific plan and a specific person, told her something about how seriously he took the risk he was describing. Gideon was not a man who worried about things that didn't warrant it. He was also not a man who dramatized things that did. "All right," she said. 6 days. He left the next morning before first light. She heard him moving around the cabin, heard the barn door, heard the horse. She didn't get up. She lay in her bunk in the loft and listened to the sound of him going, and then to the silence he left behind, which was different from the winter silences, wider, more exposed. And she lay there until it was properly light, and then she got up and went to work. The first 2 days were fine. She moved through the routines they'd established over the winter with the efficiency of someone who no longer had to think about them, the work fitting her like clothes she'd worn long enough to break in. She checked the fence line. She turned the kitchen garden beds. She split wood, carefully, with her hands fully healed now. And she didn't take the gray goat's tolerance for granted the way the brown ones made her want to. And she read in the evenings from the philosophy book that she was now 3 chapters into and still not certain what the author was arguing, which she thought might be the point. On the 3rd day, the weather changed. It came from the northwest, which was the direction that meant trouble, and it came with the blue-white cloud stacking that Gideon had described in November. She watched it build through the afternoon with a focus that was partly practical and partly something else, a quality of attention she'd developed over the winter, learning the mountain's moods the way you learn a difficult person's. By evening, the wind was hitting the cabin in gusts that made the fire draw sideways and set the shutters rattling, and by full dark, the snow had started. Not the modest, manageable snow of a late-season annoyance. The real thing. She could hear it in the silence it made, the smothered, compressed quality of air that has stopped being air and become weather. She banked the fire, brought extra wood inside, checked the barn one last time, and made sure every latch was secured. The goats were unhappy, but sheltered. The chickens were oblivious in the way that only chickens can be. The horses were tense and standing close together, the workhorse leaning into Gideon's bay in a way that was almost tender. She went back inside and she waited. By midnight, the wind was doing something she hadn't heard it do before, a lower structural note under the gusting, the kind of sound that meant it was working on things rather than just moving over them. She sat up and listened. The cabin was holding, the fire was holding. She made herself lie back down. She did not sleep. At first light, she went to the door and opened it, and the snow was thigh-high against the cabin wall, still coming, the sky completely white and uniform, no light source, no direction, just white. The world had been erased. There was the cabin and the barn, visible only because she knew exactly where to look, and beyond that, Nothing. Not in the sense of emptiness, but in the sense of a wall. She closed the door and stood with her back against it and thought about Gideon. He had gone up above the second ridge. He had 4 days of supplies. He had a camp location she didn't know precisely, only generally. North, he'd said, past the old deadfall where the main line turned east. She had a rough picture in her head from things he'd mentioned over the winter, but a rough picture and a whiteout were a combination that could kill a person as easily as any weapon. He was experienced. He knew this mountain. He had survived 12 winters up here, most of them alone. She told herself these things clearly and deliberately while she fed the animals and got the fire built up and ate a breakfast she mostly didn't taste. She told herself these things again at midday, when the snow was still coming and the wind had not let up. She told herself them a third time in the afternoon when the light started to thin and he had not come back, and the trail from the north was unreadable, buried, erased like everything else. She was still telling herself when she went to bed. She was less convinced than she had been in the morning. The storm broke on the second night. She knew it by the quality of silence that replaced the wind, a silence that had weight and completeness to it, the silence of a storm that has spent itself. She lay in the dark and listened to it and felt the temperature in the cabin change, warmer because the wind-driven cold was gone, even though the thermometer would have argued otherwise. She got up at first light and opened the door. The mountain was still, bright, crystalline, brutal in its beauty, in the way that high-altitude winter can be. Everything coded and defined, the shadows blue, the snow surface undisturbed except where the wind had sculpted it into ridges that looked almost deliberate. The sky was the hard, clear blue that follows a spent storm. The trees to the north had shed their loads and stood dark and bare against all that white. No tracks on the trail. None going up, none coming down. She stood in the doorway for a long time. He had said 5 days. She was on day 3. She had said she would wait 6. Those were the numbers. She was a person who held to the numbers she agreed to. She went inside and ate and tended the animals and tried to do the ordinary things of an ordinary day. And the ordinary things resisted her because there was nothing ordinary about the stillness on the North Trail. She split wood. She checked the fence. She came back inside. At noon, she was standing at the south window looking at the valley below when something settled in her. Not a decision exactly, more like the recognition that a decision had already been made somewhere underneath the reasoning and the waiting, and that the reasoning and the waiting were just the time it took to catch up to it. She went to the barn. She put on everything she owned that could keep out cold. 2 pairs of wool stockings, her heaviest skirt over trousers. The coat Gideon had produced from a trunk in November when he'd looked at her and assessed that what she'd arrived with was insufficient. An extra scarf wound around her face until only her eyes were exposed. She took the long coil of rope from the wall. She took the lantern, filled it, checked the wick. She took the small hand axe from the barn wall hook. She stood in the barn with these things, and she looked at herself from the outside for a moment, the way you can sometimes do when you're about to do something that might be foolish, trying to see it clearly. He had said 5 days. She was on day 3. If she went up the trail and something happened to her, there was no one to come looking. She was not a mountain trapper. She had learned the near trails, but she did not know the high country. Not really. She was a woman from the flatlands who had spent 1 winter learning to read weather and milk goats and talk to chickens. She also knew, in the specific bone-level way that she knew things she trusted, that something was wrong. Not feared wrong, not worried wrong, but known wrong. The way you know when a sound in a building is a settling sound and when it is not. She picked up the rope and the lantern and walked out of the barn, north. Well, the trail was buried but not entirely gone. Gideon had been the one to break it, back and forth over 2 seasons. And underneath the new snow, the compacted base still gave the ground a slight resistance, a difference she could feel through her boots if she moved carefully. She followed that feeling. When she lost it, she cast around at the edges, small arcs left and right, until she found it again. The cold was severe. Not the passive cold of the cabin, which you managed, but the active cold of open elevation, which manages you. Working into every gap in her clothing, finding the exposed skin at her forehead where the scarf had slipped, demanding constant attention. She pulled the scarf up and kept moving. The light was good. That was the only thing fully in her favor. A clear day after a storm, with the sun on the snow making everything merciless but visible. and she moved up through the trees with the rope over one shoulder and the lantern swinging in her left hand, not lit yet because it was still light enough, saving the oil for when she'd need it more. She passed the place she recognized as the edge of her own territory, the furthest point she'd gone on the East Trail during the autumn walks she'd taken to learn the land. Past here was Gideon's country, the country of his 12 years, and she moved into it carefully, reading what she could. An hour in, she found his first camp marker, a particular stacking of stones on the east side of a large spruce, the kind of thing you'd miss if you didn't know to look for it. She had not known to look for it, but she looked for it anyway, and she found it, and she knew she was on the right line. The second hour was harder. The trail climbed in a way that her legs had not been prepared for. Not the steady grade of the lower mountain, but the pitch and stumble of high country, where the trees thinned and the snow was deeper without the windbreak they provided. She stopped twice to rest, not because she wanted to, but because her body required it, and she had learned over the winter to listen to her body's requirements the way you listen to weather, enough to function, but not so much that you stop moving. She found the deadfall he'd described where the line turned east. An enormous fallen spruce, 3 feet across, its root ball upended and frozen into a wall of earth and ice. She turned east. 20 minutes past the deadfall, she stopped. There was something in the snow that was wrong. A shape under it, partially drifted but recognizable to her in the way that things you don't want to see are sometimes the clearest things in a landscape. Too regular to be terrain, too large to be an animal. She went toward it, and her chest had gone very tight, and her feet were moving faster than was safe on the crust. And she didn't care about the crust. He was on his side, mostly covered by 2 days of snow, one arm extended in a way that told her he had been reaching for something when the snow had him. The tree had him. A lateral limb of another fallen spruce, not the main trunk but large enough, lying across his lower legs with the particular authority of something that has come down from above at speed and landed exactly wrong. She knelt and put her hands on his face and found it cold, but not the specific cold of something that had given up. He moved. Not much, not with any coordination, but he moved, and the sound he made was not the sound of someone who was gone. It was the sound of someone who had been in pain for a very long time and had gotten below it, had gone to whatever place the body goes when it can't sustain the full experience of what's happening to it. "Gideon," she said, his name, his face, her hands. "Gideon, I'm here." His eyes opened. Not fully, not with any clarity. But they opened. "Hey," she said, close to his face, and her voice was steadier than she was. "I've got you. Stay with me." She took stock because taking stock was the first thing, the thing you had to do before you did anything else, or you would do it wrong. He was alive. He was conscious at a level below useful consciousness. The limb across his legs was 2 feet in diameter at the point of contact and had come down from maybe 15 feet, which meant impact force she didn't want to calculate. He had been here for... She looked at the snow accumulation and looked at the depth of frost at his face and made an estimate. At least 36 hours, possibly 40. The limb had to come off his legs before anything else. She could not carry him with that weight on him, could not assess what was underneath it, could not do anything useful until it was gone. She looked at the limb and at the hand axe and understood that the hand axe was not adequate to the job. Not in any amount of time that made sense. She looked at the terrain around her. The other fallen trees, the angle of the slope, the position of the limb's base end. And she looked at the rope. Her father had been a man who knew about leverage, not from books, but from a life of moving things that were too heavy for a person to move directly. And he had explained it to her once when she was 11, using a fence post and a rail and a stone as a fulcrum, and she had understood it then as a fact, and now she needed it as a tool. The limb's base end was partially suspended. It had not fallen flat, but had dropped at an angle, its far end resting on another downed tree 6 feet away. This meant the near end, the end on Gideon's legs, was in contact with the ground, but the limb itself was bridging. It was a lever already. She needed a fulcrum and a point of force. She found a half-buried log 30 inches high and 6 feet from the limb. She dug it out with her hands and the axe handle, enough to establish it was solid and rooted. She took the rope and she slung it over the limb at a point between the fulcrum position and where it rested on Gideon's legs, testing the angles, adjusting. The physics were right in theory. Theory and 6 inches of ice-crusted bark were not the same thing. She pulled. Nothing. She reset her footing. This was the part her father had not explained, how the footing was everything, how all the mechanical advantage in the world was useless if your feet slid. And she found purchase where the snow was packed hardest, and she took the rope and she pulled with everything she had, with her legs and her back and the parts of her the world had always called too much, too large, too heavy. And she pulled. The limb shifted. Quarter inch. Then an inch. Then it caught on something and stopped. She held the tension and readjusted her grip up the rope and pulled again, and this time it moved 3 inches, and then something cracked, the far end support giving. And the limb dropped suddenly, and Gideon made a sound that was almost a scream, and wasn't quite, and the limb was off his legs and on the ground beside them. She went to him immediately. He was conscious in a way he hadn't been before, the shock of the limb moving having brought him up out of wherever he'd been, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face, which was the complete absence of his usual containment, just a man in severe pain looking at the person who was there. "It's off," she said. "The tree is off." "My leg," he said. His voice was almost unrecognizable, rough and thin. "I know." She looked at his legs. The left one looked survivable. The right one had an angle at the shin that was not the leg's natural angle. "I know. Can you tell me if you feel your feet?" He tried. She watched his face as he tried. "Left one," he said. Not the right." "That could be this cold," she said, "or the position. We need to get you moving before I can know more." She sat back on her heels. Getting him down the mountain with a broken leg and 40 hours of exposure was not a problem she could solve elegantly. She was going to have to solve it the other way. She took the rope, and she looked at what she had to work with, and she started. She made a drag. She found 2 fallen branches of sufficient length and lashed them with the rope in a way that was not a proper travois, but would function as one. And she used the remaining rope to brace Gideon's right leg against the left, using his own boot and belt and her extra scarf, because immobilizing the break was not optional, and she was not going to get him down the mountain with a loose fracture moving with every step. He was conscious through this, and it was both better and worse than if he hadn't been. Better because he could tell her things. Where to brace, when to stop, what he could move and what he couldn't. Worse because she could see his face. "You need to tell me if I'm doing something that makes it worse," she said, while she worked on the leg brace. "I mean worse in a way that could cause damage, not just worse in terms of pain. I expect it hurts." "It hurts," he confirmed, with a brevity that told her how much it did. "All right." She checked the brace. It would hold. It was not comfortable, and it was not pretty, but it would hold. "I'm going to get you on this thing and pull you down. You can help when the terrain allows, otherwise your job is to stay on it." He looked at the drag. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she didn't have time to interpret. "Evelyn, we can talk about it when we get down," she said. "I just want to—" "Gideon." She looked at him directly. "I came up here because I needed to. Now I need to get you down. Can we do this?" He stopped talking and nodded. Getting him onto the drag required the particular kind of effort that leaves marks on the body for days afterward, both of them working with what they had, him using his arms and one functional leg to assist, and her taking his weight through the transitions, and the snow doing neither of them any favors. When it was done, she stood with her hands on her knees for 30 seconds, just breathing, her vision doing something she didn't like at the edges. Then she picked up the drag poles and started downhill. The light began failing at the 3rd hour. She had expected this. She had not fully reckoned with what it meant to navigate familiar trail in the dark, with a man's weight behind her, and legs that were going from heavy to something past heavy. She lit the lantern and hung it on the nearest drag pole where it threw a circle of yellow light that was enough to see 3 feet in any direction and not much more. She knew the trail. She had walked it once on the way up, which was not the same as knowing it in the dark going downhill, but it was what she had. She moved carefully, and she did not let herself think about the total distance or the total time, because those were numbers that would stop her feet if she looked at them directly. She thought about the next 10 steps. Then the next 10. Gideon spoke occasionally. Practical things, mostly. "Watch the drop here, the crust is thin on the left. There's a better line through the trees if you angle right." His voice was low and cost him something each time, and she was grateful for it because it meant he was still with her. Twice she went down. Not falls, not exactly. Her foot broke through the crust on a slope, and she went to her knees and then to her hands, and the second time the drag swung sideways, and she heard Gideon's involuntary sound, and she got up without looking at herself and repositioned and kept moving. Her hands had stopped hurting. That was the cold doing what cold does, which was both a relief and a warning she was too busy to fully attend to. The deadfall. She passed the deadfall and knew she was on the lower line and allowed herself one breath of something that might eventually become relief if they made it all the way down. Not yet. But the direction of the information was right. She found the rock marker she'd noted on the way up. Below the marker, the trees thickened again, and the trail became more protected, the snow shallower, the footing more reliable. She felt it through her legs before she consciously noted it. She kept going. The cabin appeared as a darkness in the lantern light, solid and square, and she stopped walking and looked at it for a moment with a feeling she had no word for, the feeling of something that matters having held in your absence. She had left it this morning, and it was still there, exactly where she'd left it. "We're here," she said. Gideon had gone very quiet in the last hour. She looked back and found him with his eyes open, watching her. "I know," he said. Getting him inside was the last mountain, the one she hadn't let herself think about because you do the mountains in front of you and not the ones still coming. She got the cabin door open and the fire started from the banked coals. Her hands were shaking badly now, the cold having done what it was going to do, and she worked the striker 3 times before she got a light. And she got the fire going and got the blankets, and then she went back outside and she brought him in. She could not have explained afterward precisely how she did it. She had the drag poles and the grade from the yard to the door, and she had the knowledge that there was no alternative, and those things together accomplished what physics would suggest was inadvisable for a single person of any size. She got him through the door. She got him to the blankets by the fire. She got him horizontal and covered. She sat on the floor beside him and looked at the fire and could not immediately feel her hands. "Evelyn," Gideon said. His voice was different now. In the warmth, the thin quality gone. "Your hands." She looked at them. The fingers were white at the tips in the way that required immediate attention. She knew what to do. Not ice water, not the fire directly, room temperature and patience, because the blood coming back was the dangerous part, not the cold itself. And she did it, holding her hands between her knees and waiting. And the pain when it came was vivid and specific, and she welcomed it the way you welcome pain that means something is working correctly. "Tell me if I'm wrong," she said while she waited for her hands. "Your right shin, not the ankle, not the knee. Mid-shaft." "Yes," he said. "We need to set it tonight, before the swelling gets worse." She looked at him. "I've set a bone before. My mother taught me. I won't tell you it'll be easy." "You came up the mountain," he said, in a whiteout. The storm had passed. "You came up the mountain," he said again, as if the specific conditions were beside the point he was making. He was looking at her with that same unguarded expression she'd seen when the limb came off his legs, and she found it harder to look at directly than the storm had been. "You would have done the same," she said. "I wouldn't have known where to look," he said. "I barely knew where to look," she said. "I guessed right." "Evelyn." "Gideon, I need my hands to work for the next part of this, and I need you to stop talking for a minute so I can manage that." He stopped talking. She sat with her hands between her knees and breathed through the returning sensation and listened to the fire. And outside the mountain sat in its cold and its completion, the storm spent, the night clear, the stars, the hard, brilliant points they became at altitude when the air was entirely clean. When her hands were working again, she set his leg by the firelight with 2 straight pieces of kindling as splints and strips of cloth from the mending basket, and he gripped the hearthstone with both hands and made no sound, which was its own kind of courage. And when it was done, she sat back and looked at her work and decided it was good enough. Not perfect, but good enough was what the mountain gave you, and she had learned to work with what the mountain gave. She made broth from the stock pot she kept going on the back of the stove, and she made him drink it because fluid was what his body needed more than almost anything, and she tended the fire to keep the cabin warmer than she usually did. And she made herself eat something because she had been on the mountain for 8 hours, and her body was making its own demands now. At some point in the night, she fell asleep in the chair by the fire, which was not where she intended to be. She woke to the gray pre-dawn light, and to Gideon watching her, the same direct, seeing quality in his eyes that had disconcerted her in the courthouse, and that she understood now was just how he looked at the things he was trying to understand. And You need to sleep, she said, not watch me sleep. I was thinking, he said. About what? He was quiet for a moment. About how I've been on this mountain for 12 years and I thought I knew what it took to survive up here. She waited. I was wrong about what it took, he said. That's what I was thinking. She looked at him for a moment. This man she had come to know through the winter. The books and the tools and the careful repairs and the grief behind the apron still hanging on the peg. And she thought about the rope in her coat pocket, and about the courthouse, and about the gray goat nipping her and the seedlings that had died in the March frost, and the philosophy book she still hadn't finished, and she thought that 12 years on a mountain could teach you a great deal and still leave the most important lessons for someone else to deliver. Go to sleep, Gideon, she said. He closed his eyes. She put another log on the fire and sat with her repaired hands folded in her lap and listened to the mountain outside, the creak of the cold, the settling of the cabin, the occasional sound of one of the goats in the barn registering an opinion about something, all of it holding, all of it still there. Outside, the sun came up and hit the snow and the world turned white and gold and absolute in the way it did up here when the weather decided to be generous. And Evelyn Mercer, who had been declared worth nothing by a roomful of people who did not know her, sat in a cabin above the second ridge and watched the light come in through the window and breathed in and breathed out and was, without question, exactly where she was supposed to be. He was a bad patient. She had not expected that given how contained he was about everything else. But containment, she discovered, was a personality trait that did not survive enforced stillness particularly well. By the third day, he was trying to get up, not dramatically. Gideon didn't do things dramatically. But she came in from the barn on the third morning to find him sitting on the edge of the blankets with his splinted leg extended and his jaw set in a way that told her he had been working up to this for some time. No, she said before he could speak. I need to... No, she said again. She put the milk pail down and crossed to him and looked at the leg. The swelling had come up the way it was supposed to, angry and tight, which meant the bone had not done any additional damage moving overnight, which was the important news. Whatever you think you need to do, I can do it. The east fence is holding. I checked it yesterday. The far trap line, the one above Miller's, if I don't... Gideon. She looked at him directly. You were under a tree for 40 hours. Your leg has a broken bone in it that I set with kindling and strips of my second-best skirt. You are not going to the trap line. He looked at the fire. The jaw was still set. I don't do well with sitting. I know that about you. It makes me... He stopped. What? It makes me think, he said, and the way he said it told her thinking was not always a welcome activity for him, that the movement and the work were not just productivity, but also management, a way of keeping certain rooms in his mind from getting too much light. She understood that. She understood it from the inside. She sat down on the low stool near him, which put her at roughly his eye level, and she said, What are you thinking about? He looked at his hands. They were mountain hands, broad and scarred in the way that hands get when they've been used for real things for many years. And he looked at them the way a man looks at something he's not sure how to interpret anymore. Clara, he said, and Thomas. The boy's name spoken aloud for the first time since that February evening when he told her the bare facts of their deaths. I think about them when I'm still. That's why I don't stay still. She didn't say she was sorry again. She'd said it once and he'd received it, and that was enough. Tell me about them, she said instead. He looked up. You've been carrying them alone for 4 years, she said. You don't have to do that right now. Tell me something about them. He was quiet for a long time. She waited. She had learned his silences well enough by now to know the difference between the silence that meant he wasn't going to speak and the silence that meant he was deciding how. Clara laughed too loud, he said finally. She always said she couldn't help it. She'd hear something funny and it would just come out. We were in town once. I said something at the general store, something I didn't even think was particularly funny, and she laughed so loud the storekeeper dropped his ledger. A pause. She was embarrassed about it. I never was. Evelyn said nothing. She kept very still. Thomas was 4 when they went, Gideon said. He had her laugh. He'd had it since he was about 6 months old, this enormous laugh from a very small person. I used to... He stopped, started again. I used to make him laugh on purpose, just to hear it. The fire moved. Outside, a bird called once and stopped. They were good, he said quietly, and it was the most direct he had been about them, the most stripped of anything protective. And Evelyn sat across from him and held what he was saying carefully, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else and is fragile. They were, she said, not as a question. And then they were gone, he said, and I've been… He looked at his hands again. I've been keeping busy ever since. I know, she said. He looked at her. Does it stop? He seemed to not quite have the word he wanted. The weight of it? Yes. She thought about her parents, about the fever and the trunk and Harold's house and 9 years of being reminded of what she wasn't. No, she said honestly, but it changes. It gets quieter. You start to be able to hear other things over it. He held that for a moment. What things? She almost smiled. Different things for different people, she said. For you, it might be a very loud laugh from someone in this room. He looked at her steadily for a moment, and then something happened to his expression that was not quite a smile either, but was the warmest thing she'd seen on his face in 5 months of looking at it, and she thought that was enough for one morning and stood up and picked up the milk pail. You need to eat, she said, and drink more water than you want to, and not stand on that leg. And if I do? I'll put you back on the floor, she said, and went to the stove. His recovery was slow, in the way that broken bones at 40 are slow, or what she estimated was his age, having never asked directly. The leg needed 6 weeks of real rest before it would bear weight, and Gideon's version of real rest was considerably more than the leg would have preferred, and considerably less than any medical person would have recommended. They negotiated a middle position. He could move around the cabin on a crutch she made from a forked spruce branch and a padded crosspiece, and he could sit outside in good weather, and he could do things with his hands that didn't require standing. He could not go to the barn, which bothered him more than the pain did. She brought the barn to him, in a way. She brought in the gray goat's 2 kids one afternoon in a moment of practical improvisation. They needed handling to stay friendly, and she didn't have enough hands for everything, and let them loose in the cabin, which was a decision she immediately understood was more complicated than she'd planned for, because the kids were 6 weeks old and full of opinions about everything in the cabin and Gideon's crutch in particular. He sat in his chair with a kid on each side investigating him with the complete lack of social awareness that young goats have, and his expression moved through several stages: surprise, mild alarm, something approaching resignation, and then he reached down and scratched the brown one behind its ears, and it leaned into his hand with a thud and stayed there. They need names, Evelyn said from across the room, not looking up from what she was doing. You named the mothers, he said, against my advice. My advice was correct, she said. Named animals are easier to manage. What are their names? She had already decided, but she let a moment pass as if she were thinking. The gray one is Bram. The brown one is Ada. He looked at Ada, who was now attempting to eat the fringe on his blanket. Those are good names, he said, which was Gideon's version of enthusiastic endorsement. The kids stayed in the cabin for 3 hours and caused a moderate amount of chaos, and Gideon said very little while they were there, but his face was different when they left. Less interior, less occupied with the rooms she'd been thinking about. She noted this and said nothing about it. The conversations that happened during his recovery were different from the winter conversations. Those had been the conversations of 2 people learning the edges of each other, careful and measured, always aware of the space between them. These were conversations between people who had run out of edges to learn cautiously and had to deal with what was in the middle. He asked her one evening, with the directness that came out when he was tired and his usual management of himself was running low, "What did you want? Before all of it, before your parents died, before Harold, what did you actually want?" She was darning a sock, the same activity that had started that early conversation months ago, and she put it down and thought about it seriously because the question deserved that. Land, she said. I wanted a piece of ground that was mine. My mother used to talk about it. A kitchen garden and a door I could open from the inside. She paused. That was the thing she always said. A door you can open from the inside. She grew up in a house where the women's quarters locked from the outside. That was her measure of freedom. A door she controlled. Gideon was quiet. What did you want? She asked. He looked at the fire. I had it, he said. I had exactly what I wanted. and then I didn't have it anymore, and after that I stopped thinking about it in those terms. And now? He met her eyes. Now I'm reconsidering the terms. She held his gaze for a moment and then picked up the sock because it was the right thing to do. And they sat in the fire's light, and the sock got mended, and the question his answer had raised stayed in the room with them, present and patient, not requiring anything from either of them just yet. The wolves came in the 5th week of his recovery. She heard them first as a sound at the edge of hearing, a long wavering note that the mountain threw around in a way that made direction hard to determine. She was outside checking the kitchen garden, properly established now, the seedlings she'd started in March, coming along with the confidence of plants that had survived one near-death experience, when she heard it and went still. The goats heard it too. She could hear them through the barn wall, a sudden shift in the ambient noise of the barn, the particular compressed silence of prey animals calculating threat. She went to the barn and checked the latch, the double latch she'd installed in November, the one that had not let the gray goat out during the January storm, and checked the walls and checked the small window at the back that she'd boarded over in March, when the board had started to work loose. Everything secured. She went back to the cabin. "Wolves," she said to Gideon, who was sitting up in his chair with his head tilted at the angle that meant he was already listening. "I heard them. North, maybe? Hard to tell." "How many?" "I heard one. Means at least 3. He looked at the rifle on the wall. She followed his look. He had shown her the rifle in January, shown her how to load and fire it with the matter-of-fact manner of someone teaching a practical skill rather than making a statement about anything. She had practiced twice and was adequate at 30 feet, which was close enough for the purposes she'd need it for. "I can't get to the barn," he said. It wasn't self-pity, it was information, the way he dealt in information. "I know. If they test the barn and find a weakness, the barn is tight," she said. "I checked it. If they get a scent through a gap and work at it, they can widen a gap," he said. "I've seen them do it." She looked at him. "Then I'll stay out tonight." "Evelyn, I'm not asking," she said, which was the phrase she used when something was decided, and he knew it by now. She took the rifle and the lantern and her heaviest coat, and she went out to the barn and she sat inside the door on the upturned pail she used for milking, and she waited. They came at midnight. She heard them before she saw them, heard the snow compress differently outside than it did in the wind, heard the specific silence of animals moving with purpose through the trees at the meadow's edge. Then she saw the lantern light catch eyes, 3 pairs, then a 4th, back in the trees, moving. She stood up and she opened the barn door, which surprised the wolves because the thing in the barn was not supposed to open the barn. She held the lantern high and she fired the rifle once into the air, the crack of it enormous in the cold night, and the echo from the north ridge coming back half a second later, doubling it. The eyes disappeared. She stood in the barn doorway with the rifle in one hand and the lantern in the other, and waited. The goats were in a tight cluster in the back of the barn, making a continuous low sound. Ada and Bram had their heads pressed into the gray goat's side. The horses were at the back wall, the workhorse between Gideon's bay and whatever was outside. Nothing came back. She reloaded and waited another hour, then another. At 2 in the morning she heard them again, further away, the long wavering call coming from what sounded like the north slope, moving east. Scouting, she thought, looking for easier ground. She stayed until first light. When she came into the cabin at dawn, Gideon was sitting up in his chair, which told her he hadn't slept either. "They moved off," she said. "East, I think. Looking for something easier." He looked at her, at the rifle, at the state of her after a night in the cold barn, at whatever her face was doing. "You fired once," he said. "Once was enough. They weren't committed yet." "You knew that." "I guessed," she said. "I was right." He was looking at her with the open, direct expression that still, after everything, took her a moment to receive without looking away. "Evelyn," he said. "I need coffee," she said, "and you need to eat." "Sit down," he said. Something in his voice, not commanding, not asking either, just present in a way that required a response, made her stop moving. She stood in the middle of the cabin with the rifle still in her hand and looked at him. "Sit down," he said again quietly. "Please." She sat in the chair across from him and put the rifle across her knees and waited. "I've been thinking," he said, "for several weeks now, about something I want to say to you. And every time I get close to saying it, I talk myself out of it for a reason that made sense at the time. But I'm done doing that." She was very still. "When I signed those papers in Black Ridge," he said, "I signed them because it was the right thing to do, and because I needed help, and because the alternative was leaving you there, and all of those things are true. But they don't describe what's happened since." He paused. He was looking at his hands again, the scarred, capable hands, and then he looked up at her. "You have become the most important person in my life. Not because of what you do, though what you do is, you pulled me off a mountain, Evelyn, but it's not that. It's who you are, how you think, how you are when things are hard and when things aren't. The way you named the goats, and were right about the goats. The way you read the philosophy book and told me you weren't sure what he was saying as if that was his fault." He stopped. "I'm not doing this well." "You're doing fine," she said. Her voice was steady. She was not sure how. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because of the papers, not because you don't have another option, because you do. You've built something here. You know this place as well as I do now. You could run it without me, and you know that's true. I want you to stay because I want you here, because I want to know what you think about things, because this—" He gestured, a slightly helpless gesture at the cabin, the fire, the space between them. "This feels like something I wasn't sure I'd ever find again, and I'd like to build it into something permanent, if you're willing." She sat with that for a long moment. "The courthouse papers," she said. "They say one thing. I know what they say. I want to be clear that if I say yes to this, I'm saying yes to something different from what those papers describe." "So do I," he said. "That's why I'm asking." She looked at the fire. She thought about the door her mother had always wanted, the one that opened from the inside. She thought about the rope still coiled in her coat pocket after all these months, the evidence of where she'd been and what she'd survived. She thought about the gray morning in the courthouse and the laughter in the room and the water stain on the wall she'd fixed her eyes on, and how none of those people had had any idea what they were looking at. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. Just the one breath, but it carried something in it. Relief, or the release of something that had been held tightly for a long time. "There are practical things," she said. "Your leg needs 2 more weeks before you're walking on it properly. I know that. And there's the east fence still, and the trap lines need running before the season turns. I know that too. I'm telling you so you know I've thought about it practically, and not just the other way." "I know," he said. "That's one of the things I'm asking you to stay for." She looked at him. He looked back, steady and direct and unguarded in the way she'd come to understand was his truest face, the one under the containment. She thought she could look at that face for a very long time. "Right," she said, and stood up. "I'm making coffee." They were married in Black Ridge in June, which was Evelyn's idea and Gideon's reluctant agreement. She had her reasons. She wanted the paperwork that protected her, the documentation that replaced Harold's transaction with something she had chosen, and she wanted to walk into that town as something other than what she'd been walked out of it as. And she thought that both of those things mattered in ways that were worth the discomfort of going back. Gideon's leg had healed crooked. Not badly. She had set it as well as it could be set in a cabin by firelight, and the angle was slight. But he walked with a hitch now that he would probably walk with for the rest of his life. And he had told her this matter-of-factly one morning when he first started putting weight on it, and she had told him matter-of-factly that it didn't matter, and they had left it there. He could ride, and they rode down in early June with the mountain spring behind them, and the valley below opening up in the long green way that made June the month that justified everything the other months had asked for. She had not been to Black Ridge since the November morning Gideon had walked her out of the courthouse, and she felt the approach of it in her body before she saw it. A tightening, a preparation, the muscle memory of bracing. Gideon rode beside her. He didn't say anything. He was not a man who narrated feelings back to you, which she had come to appreciate as a form of respect. He trusted her to manage herself. She did. They rode into Black Ridge on a Tuesday morning, which was a market day, which meant the main street had people on it. She sat straight in the saddle and she looked at the street, and the street looked back, in the particular way of a small town where something is being noticed and assessed. She recognized some faces. The woman outside the dry goods store, who had been laughing in the courthouse. The man near the livery who had said something she hadn't quite heard. She looked at them and they looked at her, and she thought, You thought you knew what you were looking at. You didn't. She kept writing. The magistrate's office was the same water-stained room. Colfax was the same thin man. He looked at them both, and his face did several things in rapid succession: recognition, something approaching discomfort, and then he settled into his professional neutral. "Mr. Hale," he said. "Miss Mercer." "Mrs. Hale, soon enough," Evelyn said. "We're here to file a marriage record." Colfax looked at Gideon. Gideon met his look without any particular expression. Colfax pulled his ledger toward him. The ceremony, such as it was, happened in a small chapel at the edge of town, whose minister was a practical woman in her 60s, who had clearly married a variety of frontier people under a variety of circumstances and had no opinions about any of them. She read the words, and they said the words, and Gideon put a plain band on Evelyn's finger that he'd had made by the smith in town, while Evelyn had been at the dry goods store, which meant he'd planned it and not told her, which was a very Gideon thing to do. She looked at the ring on her hand, and something moved through her that she couldn't have named. Not happiness exactly, or not only that, something older and more structural, the feeling of a thing clicking into the position it had been built for. "You had that made ahead of time," she said, when they were outside. "I was reasonably confident," he said. "You were not," she said. "You were terrified." A pause. "I was reasonably terrified," he said, and she laughed, and the laugh came out louder than she usually let it, the full real thing that she usually kept smaller in public. And a woman crossing the street nearby turned to look, and Evelyn met her eyes and didn't adjust the laugh at all. They ate lunch at the one-eating establishment Black Ridge had, which was more a large kitchen attached to a boarding house than a proper restaurant. And the woman who served them looked at Evelyn for a moment longer than was comfortable and then said, not unkindly, "I heard about what happened last fall at the courthouse." Evelyn set down her fork. "Did you?" "Wasn't right," the woman said simply and moved away. Gideon watched Evelyn after the woman left. She picked her fork back up. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm thinking that it's strange how long it took one person in this town to say that." "It is strange," he said. "And that it helps anyway," she said. "Even one." He nodded. They ate. The food was plain and warm and enough. On the way out of town, they passed Rand Colby, who was coming out of the hardware store. He saw them and went still, then made a small nod that was somewhere between acknowledgement and the private relief of someone who has gotten away with something. Gideon looked at him with the flat gray look he had and said nothing. Evelyn looked at him and said nothing either. There was nothing to say that the sight of her, upright and married and leaving the town on her own terms, didn't say better. She rode out of Black Ridge behind Gideon and did not look back. She had looked back from that town once, in November, and had decided against it then, and nothing about June had changed her mind. The second year on the mountain was different from the first in every way that counted. They had the grammar of the place, its rhythms, its demands, its specific cruelties and compensations, and they moved through it together with the efficiency of two people who have stopped calculating each other and started just working from the same understanding. Gideon's trap lines expanded in the fall. He went further and stayed longer and came back with better yields, because he had a home to come back to, and she had the place well managed, and the anxiety of the long absences was different now from both sides. Not gone, but manageable, weighted differently because there was something substantial waiting on each end of the distance. She enlarged the kitchen garden. She found that she had opinions about gardens that she hadn't known she had, preferences and theories she'd developed over the winter from the practical work of making things grow at altitude, and she pursued them with a kind of quiet intensity. She tried 3 new vegetables that Gideon was skeptical of and was right about 2 of them. She extended the south bed and put in medicinal plants, yarrow, arnica, valerian, because up here, the nearest doctor was a day's ride in good weather and nothing in good weather was guaranteed. She finished the philosophy book in October of the second year and told Gideon she thought the author was talking about the difference between what a person is and what the world decides to call them, and Gideon set down his coffee and looked at her and said, "That's it. That's exactly it. I've been reading that book for 3 years and that's it." "You needed a second opinion," she said. "Apparently," he said. She started reading the trade history aloud to him in the evenings. Not all of it, but the parts she found interesting, which turned out to be most of it, and he would listen and add things he knew from his years on the lines, and the book became a kind of conversation between what was written and what he'd actually lived, which was better than either one alone. In November of the second year, she realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for a day before she said anything, not from any desire to keep it from him, but because she needed a day with it by herself first, needed to turn it around and look at it from all sides and understand what she felt. What she felt was complicated. Complicated in the way that good things are complicated when you haven't had many of them, and you've learned to look for the problem before the problem finds you. She told him that evening. She said it plainly, the way she said most things. "I'm pregnant." He went very still. She watched him. She watched him go through something, work through something, and she knew what he was working through because she knew him now the way you know a person you've shared a winter with, a crisis with, a slow accumulation of ordinary days with. He was feeling two things at once that were difficult to feel at once, joy and fear, the two things that would always now be paired for him when it came to this particular hope. "Gideon," she said. He came back into his face. He looked at her. "I know," she said quietly. "Both of those things. I know." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He didn't speak. His hand was heavy and warm and scarred, and she turned her hand over and held it, and they sat like that while the fire did its work, and the mountain held them in the late November dark. "We'll be careful," he said finally. "We will," she said. "You'll tell me when you need something." "I'll tell you," she said. "You'll listen." "I always listen to you," he said, which was more or less true, with the exception of the first 3 days after the tree had fallen on him, and she decided not to raise those days just now. She was careful. She was also herself, which meant she was not careful in the sense of diminished. She didn't stop working, didn't stop managing the place, didn't let the pregnancy rearrange her into something fragile. She modified what needed modifying, let Gideon take more of the heavy lifting without making a ceremony of it, and she kept her eye on what her body was telling her and trusted it the way she'd learned to trust the weather, as information, not verdict. The winter of the second year was harder than the first in some ways, and softer in others. Harder because she was tired in a way she hadn't been. A deep bone-level tired that was different from work tired and that no amount of sleep fully fixed. Softer because there were two of them in the cabin who both knew what the winter was, and neither of them was learning it anymore. And that knowledge made the cold more manageable even when it was worse. Gideon widened the doorframe to the bedroom in January. She hadn't said anything about the doorframe. She'd been moving sideways through it since November without complaint, and she came in from the barn one afternoon to find sawdust on the floor and the doorframe 3 inches wider than it had been that morning. She stood in the wider doorway. "It was too narrow," he said, from his chair, not looking up from what he was mending. "It was," she agreed. "Should have done it last year," he said. "Yes," she said, and she came in through the wider door and she did not say anything else about it. And he did not either, because they both knew it was not only about the doorframe. In February, during a cold spell that kept them both inside for 4 days, Gideon told her about Thomas. Not the fact of him. He'd told her that in the first winter. But the actual Thomas, the particular small person who had existed for 4 years on this mountain and laughed too loud like his mother. He told her the specific things, the things that were hard to hold, but harder to lose. That Thomas had been afraid of the barn cat until he was 3, and then suddenly, one day, had walked up to it and sat down beside it as if they'd come to a private arrangement. That he'd called the workhorse the big one because he hadn't been able to manage the horse's name. That he'd had a habit of putting his hand on Gideon's knee when they sat together that Gideon had not thought about in 4 years, because thinking about it was too particular, too small, and specific to survive the thinking. Evelyn listened to all of it. When he was done, she said, "He sounded like a good boy." "He was," Gideon said. "Tell me more," she said. "Not tonight, if you don't want to, but more, when you can. I'd like to know him, as much as I can." Gideon looked at her with the open face, the unguarded one. "Why?" he asked, and it was a real question, not a deflection. "Because he was yours," she said, "and you're mine, and I want to know the whole of you, including the parts that hurt." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Okay," and his voice was rough at the edges, and that was the end of that conversation, but it was not the end of that subject. And over the remaining winter weeks he came back to it in small pieces, a detail here, a memory there, until Thomas was a real person in the cabin with them. Not a ghost, not a wound, but a person who had been here and been loved and whose absence was real, but whose presence in Gideon's telling was also real. And that felt right to Evelyn in a way she couldn't have explained but trusted. Their daughter was born in late March, when the snow was still on the ground, but the quality of light had started to change. She was born the way births on mountains are born, without a doctor, without ceremony, with a great deal of practical effort, and Gideon present the whole time in a way that was more useful than she'd expected, steady and focused, and not giving her anything to manage except the work itself. She was a large baby, which Evelyn took as a personal satisfaction, and she was loud from her first breath, a fact that the goats in the barn registered with a collective startled silence and then resumed their business. Gideon held her and looked at her with the expression Evelyn had been waiting to see on his face. The one she'd known was there somewhere, the one that was not grief and not fear, but the thing underneath both of them, the thing grief and fear had been covering for 4 years. "Margaret," Evelyn said, "if that's all right." He looked up. She knew he was thinking about Clara, about Thomas, about the people who had been here and weren't. She waited. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was whole when he said it, all the way through, no fracture in it. "Yes, that's right." She put her head back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling of the cabin she had come to by accident and made into a home, and she listened to her daughter's voice filling the room, enormous and insistent and completely indifferent to everything the world had thought about her mother. And she thought that this, exactly this, was what the courthouse room had not been able to imagine when it looked at her and decided what she was worth. She reached into the pocket of her coat where it hung on the peg by the door. The rope was still there. She had carried it all this way, through 2 winters and a blizzard and a broken leg and a marriage and a new life built from nothing. And now she held it in her hand and looked at it for a long moment, and then she put it on the hearthstone and she let the fire have it. It caught and burned and was gone in less than a minute. The baby was still crying. Gideon was still holding her, talking to her in a low voice that Evelyn couldn't quite hear, and outside the mountain held the last of its winter quietly. And somewhere in the spruce trees a bird that had come back early called once and waited for an answer. Margaret learned to walk in April of her first year, which was earlier than Evelyn had expected, and later than Margaret herself seemed to think was acceptable. She had been pulling herself along the cabin furniture for 2 weeks with the focused determination of someone who understood exactly what she wanted and was annoyed by the gap between intention and ability. And then one morning she simply let go of the chair and walked 4 steps to the woodbox and put her hand on it and looked at Evelyn with an expression that said, "There, that's done." Evelyn was on her knees in the kitchen garden bed, her hands in the dirt, and she saw it through the open cabin door, and she sat back on her heels and felt something move through her that was too large for the moment and exactly right for it at the same time. She told Gideon that evening. He had been out on the near trap line, a day trip, and he came in still cold from the ride, and she told him before he'd even taken off his coat. She walked today, 4 steps to the woodbox. He stopped with one arm still in the sleeve. 4 steps. Without holding anything. He finished taking off the coat and hung it on the peg and stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she could see in the set of his shoulders that he was feeling the thing he'd learned to feel again over this past year, that love was a real risk, that it required you to stand in the open, and that standing in the open was worth it, and that all 3 of those things were true at the same time, and none of them canceled the others out. "She's going to be into everything," he said finally. "She already is," Evelyn said. "Ada is afraid of her." He turned around and there it was. The full thing. The laugh that was also Thomas's laugh, the one she'd learned to listen for. It came out and it filled the cabin, and Margaret, sitting on her blanket by the fire, looked up at the sound and made a noise back that was halfway to a laugh of her own. It was not a perfect moment. Evelyn's knees hurt from the garden and supper was behind where it should be, and the brown goat had gotten into the early lettuce that afternoon and eaten half of it. And Gideon's hip was giving him the trouble it sometimes gave him since the leg healed crooked, and Margaret was going to need feeding in an hour, and the sound she made when she needed feeding was not a subtle sound. None of it was perfect. All of it was real, and real was the thing Evelyn had wanted more than anything else for as long as she could remember. The 3rd year brought a neighbor. Not close, nothing up here was close, but a family named Delaney had taken a homestead claim in the lower valley, 4 miles south as the trail ran, and in August of that year Ruth Delaney appeared at the cabin door on a horse that had seen better days, with a basket of early apples, and the practical directness of a woman who had decided to know her nearest neighbor and had come to accomplish that. She was maybe 40, lean and angular with sun-dark skin and the kind of eyes that took in a room once and remembered everything in it. She looked at Evelyn's kitchen garden, which by the third year had become something considerably more than a kitchen garden, and she said, "You've got arnica growing up here." "I have," Evelyn said. "My husband has a bad knee, the kind that doesn't respond to much." "I know the kind," Evelyn said, and she thought of Gideon's hip and his leg with its permanent hitch, and she went inside and came back with a small jar of the arnica preparation she'd been making since the second year, and Ruth Delaney took it and looked at it and then looked at Evelyn with the frank appraisal of someone deciding whether to invest trust. "I heard about you," Ruth said. "What happened in Black Ridge before you came up here?" Evelyn met her eyes. "What did you hear?" "I heard they treated you badly," Ruth said, "and that you came up the mountain and made something of it anyway." A pause. "I've got two girls. I tell them stories like that." Evelyn looked at this woman on the tired horse with her basket of apples and felt something she had not felt since before her parents died, which was the specific warmth of a woman deciding to be your friend, the way women do when they've assessed the situation and decided you're worth it. "Come inside," Evelyn said. "I'll make coffee." Ruth Delaney became the first of what would become, over the following years, a loose constellation of neighboring families scattered through the valley and the lower slopes. They came in ones and twos, the Millers, who Gideon had mentioned in the context of emergency plans, and who turned out to be a broad, cheerful family of 6. The Beaumont brothers, 2 bachelors who ran sheep on the East Meadow and had between them the social skills of one functional person. A widow named Harriet Cross, who had come west from Ohio with a wagon full of books and opinions and had no intention of returning. They came because the frontier was like that, drawing people who needed space and then making them need each other, the two needs existing in permanent negotiation. Evelyn was the person they came to. She had not sought this. It was not a role she'd applied for or even recognized she was growing into until Ruth pointed it out, 2 years after that first apple and arnica visit, sitting at Evelyn's table with coffee between them. "You know you're the one people come to," Ruth said. "For the arnica, maybe." "For everything," Ruth said. "Martha Miller came to you when her youngest had that lung sickness. Harriet Cross comes here every time she needs to think something through. The Beaumont boys show up when one of them has done something the other one can't fix." Ruth looked at her steadily. "People come to you because you know things, and you don't make them feel small for not knowing them. That's a specific skill, and it's rarer than arnica." Evelyn looked at her coffee. "I know what it feels like," she said, "to be made small." "I know you do," Ruth said. "That's why you're good at it." Margaret was 3 when Evelyn realized she was pregnant again. This time, she sat with it for only a few hours before she told Gideon, because she had learned something from the first pregnancy that was applicable here, that withholding things from him to protect him was a habit built in someone else's house, in someone else's version of her life, and it had no place in this one. She told him the same way she'd told him the first time, plain, direct, no cushioning around it. He set down what he was working on and looked at her. The fear was there. She could see it, that specific Gideon fear that was grief wearing a different coat. And then something else came up through it, something that had been getting stronger each year, the muscle of hope that you build by using it even when it's difficult. "Okay," he said. "That's your response?" Yes. "Okay. That's good." He stood up, which he sometimes did when he was managing something large. "Are you well?" "I'm fine. I'm tired. I was tired with Margaret, too." "I remember." "You were very helpful when I was tired," she said. "I remember that." He looked at her, reading the room. "Was that sarcasm?" "Only a little," she said. "You were mostly helpful. The week when you kept asking if I needed to sit down every 20 minutes was less helpful." "You were 8 months along in carrying fence posts," he said. "They weren't heavy fence posts." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a groan and sat back down, and she went back to what she'd been doing, and Margaret came in from outside with dirt on both knees and something in her fist that turned out to be a beetle she'd decided to befriend. And the cabin was loud and full and imperfect in all the specific ways their life was imperfect, and it was exactly right. The second child was a boy. He came in January of that 4th year, a winter birth, slower than Margaret's and harder. The kind of labor that lasts long enough that you stop measuring it in hours and start just measuring it in what's still in front of you. Gideon was there the whole time, the way he'd been for Margaret, steady in the way that counted. Not cheerful, not reassuring in empty ways, just present, doing what needed doing when she told him, and not adding to the difficulty when she didn't. The boy was smaller than Margaret had been, and quieter, though that was a relative scale. He found his voice within the first day and deployed it regularly and without apparent self-consciousness. They named him James, for no reason more elaborate than that both of them had always liked the plainness of it, and James grew into his name the way the name seemed to have predicted. Straightforward, uncomplicated, a person who wanted to know how things worked and didn't have much patience for anything that didn't. Margaret, at 3.5, received James with the careful suspicion of someone who has been the primary person in a household and recognizes a threat to that position. She was polite to him in the specific way of a child being polite when she's waiting to form a real opinion. By the time James was 6 months old, she had formed it. He was acceptable, primarily as an audience for her activities, and she would protect him fiercely from anything that was not her. They were children who grew up on a mountain, which meant they grew up knowing things that children in towns didn't know and not knowing things that children in towns took for granted. Margaret could read weather by the time she was 5. James could identify every plant in his mother's garden by 6 and knew which ones had medicinal properties and which ones would cause problems if the goats got to them. Both of them could ride before most children their age could reliably navigate stairs. They were also children who grew up in a house where the people in it said what they meant, disagreed with each other plainly, made mistakes and acknowledged them, and worked through difficulty without pretending it wasn't there. This was not a philosophy Evelyn had consciously chosen to parent by. It was simply the way she and Gideon were, and the children absorbed it the way children absorb the air of the house they're raised in. Harold Mercer came to the mountain in the spring of Evelyn's 5th year there. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horse, and she looked up and saw the figure coming down the north trail from the ridge, which was wrong because visitors came from the south, from the valley. And she stood with her trowel in her hand and watched him come, and when he was close enough to recognize, she felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with temperature. He had aged. He was thinner than she remembered, and the confidence that had always held him upright had done something, settled or shifted, and he sat his horse differently than the man who had stood in Colfax's office and itemized her costs by the meal. He looked like a man who had something to ask for, which was a new configuration for his face. She did not go to meet him. She waited. He pulled up at the edge of the garden. "Evelyn," he said. "Harold," she said. He looked at the garden, the cabin, the expanded barn, the shed with its sound roof, the slope behind the house where the goats were grazing. He looked at all of it with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. "You've done well," he said. "Yes," she said. Not a thank you, not a softening, just the confirmation. "I heard you'd married. Hale, the trapper." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work up to whatever he had come to say. Behind her, the cabin door opened and she heard Gideon's step on the porch. The particular sound of it, the hitch in his gait that she could identify in the dark, and knew he had seen the horse and come out. "I'm not well," Harold said. "I've had some trouble. The business—" He stopped. "I thought, what did you think?" she said. He looked at her. Whatever he'd prepared to say was not surviving her expression, which she was not trying to make welcoming. "I thought family might—" "I'm going to stop you there," Evelyn said, and her voice was very even. Not cold, not hot. Even, the way a blade is even. "I want you to hear me clearly, Harold, so I'll say it once. You are not family to me. Family is a word for people who treated you like one. You kept a roof over my head for 9 years and reminded me of the cost of it every single day. You put rope on my wrists and sold me in a courthouse to settle a gambling debt. We are not family." Harold's face did several things. Shame was in there, and defensiveness, and something that might have been genuine recognition, and she didn't much care which one won. "I'm not going to turn you away hungry," she said. "That's not who I am. You can eat and rest your horse and go." Gideon said nothing from the porch. She hadn't asked him to say anything, and he didn't. He stood there the way he stood when he'd decided something and was waiting for it to play out, steady and present and not requiring any direction. Harold ate at the table, which was the table that was the right height, in the cabin that had been built by one person and made into a home by two. Margaret and James were with Ruth Delaney for the afternoon, and Evelyn was grateful for that, because she did not want her children in the same room as this history while she was still in the middle of deciding what to do with it. He didn't ask again for what he'd come to ask for. Maybe her clarity about what she was and wasn't willing to give had removed the avenue. Or maybe sitting in her house, at her table, eating her food, something had shifted in his accounting of the situation. She didn't know, and she didn't ask. When he was ready to leave, she walked him to his horse. "I'm not angry at you anymore," she said, which was true, and surprised her a little with its truth. "I was for a long time. I don't have much room for it now." He looked at her. "I know what I did." "I believe you," she said. "That's going to have to be enough." He mounted and rode south toward the valley, and she watched him go, and then she went back to the kitchen garden and she picked up her trowel and she planted the rest of the row she'd been working on when he arrived. Gideon came and stood at the garden's edge. "All right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and then, "I meant it. I'm not angry anymore. I thought I would be, seeing him, but I'm not. I'm just—" She looked for the word. "Done with it. I'm done with carrying it." "That's different from letting him off the hook," Gideon said. "I know it is," she said. "One's about him, the other's about me." He nodded. He went back inside. She kept planting them. The years had a way, on that mountain, of stacking up with a density that flat country years didn't have. Each season demanded so much that it left a mark, and the marks accumulated into something that was the texture of a life fully lived, not smoothly or without cost, but completely, with all the material showing. Margaret was 7 and James was 4 when Evelyn started teaching the Valley children. It happened the way most things in her life had happened, sideways, from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Ruth Delaney's girls had been learning their letters from Ruth, whose own education had stopped at a point that left her teaching confidently up to a particular level and uncertainly beyond it. She mentioned this to Evelyn, not as a request but as a fact, the way Ruth mentioned most things. And Evelyn, who had been educated by a mother who believed fiercely in the practical value of knowing things, and who had read every one of Gideon's 30 books twice and ordered more through the supply runs, said, "Send them up on Tuesdays." Ruth sent them up on Tuesdays, and word went through the valley the way words did. And by the following month, there were 6 children at Evelyn's table on Tuesday mornings, ranging from Margaret's age down to a 5-year-old Beaumont nephew who was visiting and who turned out to be the most naturally gifted reader Evelyn had ever encountered, which she mentioned to his uncle, who had no idea what to do with the information but filed it with evident pride. She was not trained as a teacher. She taught the way she'd learned everything else that mattered, by understanding what the other person needed and working from that point outward. She found that she was good at it, which was not something she'd expected, and she found that the children were good for her in a way she hadn't anticipated, their questions requiring her to know why she knew things, rather than just that she knew them, which sharpened her thinking in directions she hadn't known needed sharpening. Gideon built a longer table. He didn't announce this plan. He simply spent a week with wood and tools in the evenings. And one morning there was a table that could seat 10 instead of 4, which was the Gideon version of an opinion about whether this should continue. "It's a good table," Evelyn said. "It's level," he said. "That was the main challenge. The floor's not." "How did you—" "Shims," he said, "under the short legs." She ran her hand along the surface. "I thought you didn't want more people coming up the trail." "I didn't say that." "You said, and I'm quoting, 'The more people who know the trail, the more people who use the trail.'" "I stand by that," he said. "It's still true. But the children need the schooling." She looked at him. This man who had bought her out of a courthouse because something wasn't right, and who had built a table for children he'd never have sought out on his own, who had widened the bedroom door frame without saying so, and built her a chair that fit without naming it a gift. She thought about what love looked like when it was not performed, when it was just a practice, daily and ordinary, and as structural as the beams overhead. "You're a good man," she said. "I'm trying to be," he said, which was his most honest answer to anything, not claiming to have arrived anywhere, just pointing to the direction he was moving. The hardest year was the 7th, not because of any single thing, but because of the accumulation, the way some years are just harder in the aggregate. More that goes wrong, more that needs more that costs more than you budgeted for. A late frost in May killed a third of the kitchen garden. One of the horses went lame in August in a way that didn't fully resolve. Gideon's hip, which had been manageable for years with the right weather and the right pace, became less manageable in September in a way they both noted without discussing at length, because discussing it at length was not how they handled things that were happening slowly and couldn't be fixed quickly. Harriet Cross's wagon had burned in July, a lamp overturned, the whole thing catching in minutes. And she had lost most of her books, which was the loss that mattered to Harriet more than the practical losses. Because Harriet understood that books were not decoration but structure, the framework of a thinking person's interior life. Evelyn had given her 6 from their own shelf without mentioning it, and Gideon had quietly started building Harriet a small bookcase, one that would sit in the corner of her rebuilt cabin, because neither of them could do anything about the lost books, but they could do something about the structure that would hold new ones. And in November of that year, Margaret fell from the pasture fence she'd been walking along, despite being told 17 times not to walk along it, and broke her arm. And Evelyn said it with the knowledge and the materials she had, and Margaret cried with the particular fury of a child who is hurt, and also knows she caused the hurt herself. And Evelyn held her and let her cry and didn't say anything about the fence. Afterward, with Margaret splinted and sleeping, Evelyn sat at the table and Gideon sat across from her, and they looked at each other in the way of two people who are tired at the same level and know it. "Hard year," he said. "Yes," she said. "We've had worse." She thought about that first winter, the January cold and the water barrel frozen solid, and the firewood calculation that wasn't quite right. She thought about the blizzard and the broken leg and the 8 hours on the mountain. "We have," she said, "though not many." "Worse than this," he said, "at the start. Before you were—" He paused, and she knew he was choosing between before you were here and before we were us, and she let him choose. "Before we figured it out," he said. "We haven't completely figured it out," she said. "No," he said, "but we know where to start." She reached across the table and put her hand over his the way he'd done the night she told him about James, and they sat like that while the fire did its work, and Margaret breathed in the loft above them with the deep unconscious breathing of a sleeping child, and outside the mountain moved into its winter business, and neither of them needed to say anything else. In the 8th year they expanded the cabin. Not the small expansions of necessity, the wider door frame, the longer table, but a real expansion, a full room added to the east side that became a schoolroom 3 days a week, and a family room the rest of the time. Gideon and the Miller boys did the frame and the roof over the course of the summer, and Evelyn and Ruth Delaney did the finishing, and it was not a pretty room, the proportions slightly off. The way the original cabin's additions had been slightly off, because these were working people building what they needed with what they had, and aesthetics came last. But there was a window on the south side that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the room warm and golden from about 2 in the afternoon until the sun dropped behind the ridge, and Evelyn had put 2 long shelves on the west wall for books. And the table was long and the chairs were mismatched, and it was the room where she taught 12 children on 3 days a week, and where James spent his Saturday mornings reading things 3 levels above what most adults expected of a 9-year-old, and where Margaret, at 11, had started helping with the younger students in a way that was partly helpfulness and partly the management of a very organized personality that needed somewhere to put itself. The day the room was finished, Evelyn stood in it alone for a few minutes. It was an ordinary afternoon, Gideon outside, the children somewhere in the pasture doing something she'd been informed she didn't need to worry about. The mountain its usual autumn self, stripped back and clear and beginning to pull into itself for the coming cold. She thought about the courtroom. She thought about the water stain on Colfax's wall that she'd fixed her eyes on while the room laughed. She thought about the rope in her coat pocket, which she'd carried for 4 years and burned one March morning when her daughter was 4 steps old. She had never been back to Black Ridge after the June wedding. She didn't need to go back. The town existed in her as a fact, a data point about what people are capable of when they have decided someone is not worth their consideration, and she had decided a long time ago not to organize her understanding of herself around other people's failures of imagination. This room, these shelves, this window, these mismatched chairs, was more informative than the courthouse had ever been. This told the truth about what she was and what she was capable of. The courthouse had told the truth about what other people were and what they were capable of, which was a different and less useful piece of information. She went to the window and looked out at the valley. 8 years she'd been looking at it from this altitude, and it still did the thing it had done the first time she'd seen it, made her stop and acknowledge it, the involuntary response to something that is, on its own terms, overwhelming. Gideon came in behind her. She heard him before she turned. The step, the hitch, the particular sound of him crossing a room. He stood beside her at the window. "It's a good room," he said. "It is," she said. "The window's well placed. I asked Ruth about it. She knows about light." He looked out at the valley. After a moment, "I keep thinking about something." "What?" "That morning in Black Ridge when I walked in." She turned to look at him. He was still looking out the window. "What about it?" "I've thought about what would have happened if I hadn't gone to the courthouse that morning, if I'd just loaded the supplies and headed back up." He paused. "If I hadn't been curious about what was happening." "You were curious," she said. "I'm not usually curious about courthouse business," he said. "I walked past a dozen times and never went in. That morning I did." He looked at her. "I've thought about why." "What do you think?" "I think some things don't have a sensible explanation," he said. "I think sometimes you walk through a door because you walk through a door, and then everything comes from that." She considered this. It was more philosophical than Gideon usually went, at least out loud, and she thought the new room and the afternoon light had something to do with it, the way certain atmospheres make certain things easier to say. "I walked out of that courthouse thinking I'd traded one problem for another," she said. "I was wrong, but I didn't know I was wrong for a long time." "When did you know?" She thought about it seriously. "The table," she said. "When you raised the table that third morning without saying anything, that's when I thought this might be different." He was quiet for a moment. "That was purely practical," he said. "The table was too low." "Gideon." "It was." "I know what it was," she said. "That's what I'm telling you." He understood that. She could see it in his face, the way he received it. Not embarrassed, not dismissive, just present with it, the way he was present with things that mattered. "I'm glad I walked through the door," he said. "So am I," she said. Margaret was 12 when she asked about Black Ridge. Not casually. Margaret rarely asked things casually. She had her father's habit of deciding to say a thing and then saying it without the extended preamble most people used. She asked on a Tuesday after the other children had gone, while she was helping Evelyn stack the books at the end of the school morning. "Tell me what happened," she said. "In Black Ridge, before you came here." Evelyn looked at her. 12 was old enough. 12 was the age her mother had started treating her like a person who could handle real information, and Evelyn had always thought her mother had been right about that. She told her. Not everything. Margaret was 12, not 40, but the shape of it, the true shape. The uncle, the debt, the courthouse, the rope on her wrists, the room laughing. She told it plainly, the way she'd learned to hold it, without drama but without softening it either, because softening it would have been a form of dishonesty, and she did not want to be dishonest with her daughter about the world. Margaret listened with the serious attention she brought to things she'd decided mattered. When Evelyn finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared?" she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Very." "You didn't act scared." "I didn't have the option of acting scared," Evelyn said. "Sometimes you don't, so you do the other thing instead." "What's the other thing?" "You keep your chin up," Evelyn said. "You look at the wall above their heads. You don't give them your eyes." Margaret thought about this with the focused intensity that was her primary way of engaging with the world. And then Papa came in, and then your father came in, because it wasn't right. That's what he said. Margaret looked at the books in her hands. What if he hadn't come in? It was the question Evelyn had asked herself in different forms, at different hours over 8 years. What if he hadn't been curious that morning? What if the supply run had been a different day? What if Colfax had moved faster through the proceedings? "I don't know," she said honestly. "Something else would have happened. It might have been worse. It might have been different. I don't know." "But you would have been okay," Margaret said. It was not quite a question. Evelyn looked at her daughter, this broad-shouldered, direct-eyed, mountain-raised girl who was going to be a force in whatever part of the world she eventually occupied. "I hope so," she said. "I'd like to think so. But I can't promise you that, and I'm not going to." The world is not reliably fair, and people are not reliably good, and sometimes very bad things happen to people who didn't deserve them. Margaret looked at her. That's not very comforting. No, Evelyn said. But the other thing I can tell you is this. The people in that room thought they were telling the truth about me. They thought what they were saying was real, and they were completely wrong. That's also true. The world can be unfair, and people can be cruel and still be wrong about you. You get to know the difference, even when they don't. Margaret was quiet for a long time, the way she was quiet when she was actually absorbing something rather than just processing it. Then she said, "Is that why you teach? The children?" Evelyn considered. "Partly," she said. "Partly because your grandmother believed in knowing things, and I believe in her. And partly because being made to feel small because you don't know something is a specific pain that I have some experience with, and I'd rather these children not have that experience if I can prevent it." "You were never small," Margaret said, with the simple certainty of a 12-year-old who means it literally and figuratively at once. Evelyn laughed. "I know," she said. "That was rather the problem for a while." Gideon's hip required a cane in the 10th year. He did not accept this gracefully at first, and then he did, which was the Gideon pattern with everything that required acceptance. Resistance followed by the practical acknowledgement that resistance was not changing the facts, followed by adaptation. The cane he eventually settled on was one he'd made himself from a branch of mountain ash, the right height and weight, and he used it with the same efficiency he brought to his other tools, without complaint and without self-consciousness. He stopped running the far trap lines that year. He ran the near ones, the ones he could manage in a day, and James, at 13, had started going out with him on the closer routes, learning the work the way Gideon had learned it, through doing, through asking, through the mountain's own instruction. James took to it with the methodical patience that was his particular quality, recording things in the small notebook he always carried, building knowledge the way he built everything, carefully, from the foundation up. Margaret, at 16, had started going to Black Ridge periodically to teach at the small school that had been established there the previous year, writing down on the Tuesday she'd freed up by handing her Valley students to an older girl who had proven capable. She went and she taught and she came back. And the first time she came back, she said, over supper, without particular drama, "I understand now why you never went back." "And," Gideon said, "and I also understand why you did, the once." She looked at her mother. "You needed to walk out of there yourself." "Yes," Evelyn said, "that's exactly it." Margaret nodded and passed the bread and moved on, because she was 16 and had made her assessment and was ready to proceed, and Evelyn sat with the particular strange feeling of watching her own thought clearly articulated by a person she had made, who was better than her at articulating things, and entirely her own. Well, it was in the 11th year, on an October afternoon, with the aspens gone yellow, and the sky the deep October blue, that was the mountain's best trick, that Evelyn stood on the porch and looked at the valley below and took a real accounting. Not a sentimental one, a real one, the way she'd always done things. Clearly, without decoration, looking at what was actually there. What was there? A cabin that had started as one man's survival structure and had become something else. Something that had a long table and mismatched chairs and a schoolroom with afternoon light. A shelf of books that had started at 30 and was now over 100. 2 children who were becoming specific people she found genuinely interesting. A man inside who was reading the trade history she'd already read twice and occasionally called out passages to her that he wanted to discuss. A kitchen garden that had outlasted 3 late frosts and 2 drought summers, and a determined goat. Neighbors who came up the trail. A community that had the cabin at the center of it, not because she'd sought that position, but because she'd turned out to be the kind of person who knew how to hold things. And below the valley, a town called Black Ridge that had once held a courthouse where a room of people had decided she was worth $41.60 and a laugh. She had thought about those people over the years with varying degrees of feeling, anger in the first years, something colder and more complex as time went on. And then, gradually, a kind of distance that was not forgiveness exactly, but was its neighbor. She had thought about what it meant that they had been so certain and so wrong. She had turned this over many times, and she had arrived, after 11 years, at an understanding of it that felt true. The courthouse room had not been seeing her. They had been seeing something they'd already decided on before she walked in. A woman who was too large, too poor, too unclaimed, too much, and too little at once. and they had called that thing by her name and assumed they had her right. They had not had her right. They had never come close. This was not an unusual human failure. It was, in fact, the most common one, the error of deciding what you're looking at before you've actually looked. She had done it herself, to people and to places and to her own possibilities, and she had learned over 11 years to catch herself doing it, and to look again, more slowly, more carefully, with fewer conclusions already in place. The cruel voices in the courthouse had not been telling the truth. They had been telling a story they had assembled from assumptions and convenience and the particular pleasure some people take in having a target. The truth had taken 11 years to build and was not finished building, and it looked like this: a valley, a cabin, 2 children, a man with a cane and a crooked leg, and 30 years of mountain knowledge, a schoolroom with afternoon light. It looked like Tuesday mornings and mismatched chairs and arnica in small jars and a long table that was level because of shims under the short legs. It looked like a door you could open from the inside. Gideon came out and stood beside her. He didn't say anything, which was right, because nothing needed saying just now. He stood with his cane, and she stood without one, and they looked at the valley the way they'd looked at it on 100 October afternoons. And the aspens moved in the light wind, and somewhere in the pasture below them, James was talking to the horses in the quiet way he'd inherited from his father, and Margaret would be back from Blackridge before dark. "The Delaney girl asked me today," Evelyn said, "whether I'd ever thought about leaving, going somewhere less remote." "What did you say?" "I said I'd thought about it once, when I first arrived. That first night by the fire, when I didn't know what any of it was going to be." He looked at her. "And now?" She looked at the valley, at the aspens and the sky and the mountains that held the sky up on 3 sides, at the trail going south toward the Delaney place and the Miller place, and Harriet Cross's rebuilt cabin with its new bookcase, at the barn where Bram and Ada's grandchildren were currently making a noise that suggested strong feelings about something. "Now it doesn't occur to me," she said. "This is the place." He nodded once. It was enough. They stood on the porch of the cabin until the light started to angle toward evening, and then Evelyn went inside to start supper and Gideon came after, and the fire was built and the lamp was lit, and the long table was set, and outside the mountain pulled its October darkness up around itself and held everything it held: the trail and the valley and the schoolroom and the grave of a woman named Clara and a boy named Thomas who had laughed too loud, and the kitchen garden going to seed, and the horses in the barn, and 2 people who had found each other in a courthouse by accident and had decided for 11 years running that the accident was the best thing that had ever happened to them. There is a particular thing that happens to people who have been told they are worth nothing and who survive it and build something anyway. It is not that they forget what was said. They don't forget. The courthouse is always somewhere in the memory, specific and real. The rope, the laughter, the water stain on the wall. What changes is not the memory, but its position. It moves from the center of the room to the edge of it, and what takes its place in the center is the evidence. The table raised 4 inches, the shingles replaced, the 2 kids born in the March barn, the 8 hours on the mountain, the rope burned in the fire. The cruel voices are never the truth. They are only the loudest voices at the worst moment, speaking from the smallness of a room that cannot imagine what lies above its own elevation. The truth is quieter, and it takes longer, and it is built the way everything real is built, slowly, imperfectly, through work and weather, and the kind of love that does not announce itself but shows up every morning and does what the day requires. Evelyn Hale had been told once what she was worth, by people who had not taken the trouble to find out. She had spent 11 years finding out for herself, and the answer was still being written, and it was longer and more complicated and more interesting than anything that room had been capable of imagining. She put supper on the table. She called her children in. She listened to the mountain settle into its night. She was, in all the ways that counted, exactly where she had always been going.